Morning, everyone. I just want to welcome you all to the third day of the Data Science and Industry Student Workshop. Today's presenter is Professor Duncan Coulter, who is the Deputy Head of the Academy of Computer Science and Software Engineering, and he will be discussing Q-learning from experience with us today. Thank you very much, Professor, for being with us, and we really look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Let's begin. So for what it's worth, my background is more in artificial intelligence than in data science. And I think many people sometimes consider those to be almost synonyms of each other. And that's not entirely true, because there's definitely overlapping concerns between things like artificial intelligence and machine learning and data science. So there's lots of points of intersectionality between them. If you would draw the Venn diagrams, there'd be a fair degree of overlap between them. But I will be presenting this from a sort of more AI point of view than data science, sort of as a counterpoint to some of the other things you might be seeing. So basically the environment that we're finding ourselves in is data science and machine learning often work at their best and are focused on when you have a lot of data that you would like to process, existing data sets, or something that you would like to analyze. However, in reality, that's the hard part. Data curatorship and getting access to data is difficult, and high quality data, as you know, has been referred to as digital gold these days. So what do you do in situations where there isn't data available, but there's an environment that you're in that you can take actions in, and those actions may or may not pay off? And how can you learn through interacting with the environment, through experience, rather than from an explicit data set that you might want or that you may not have? So there are certain kinds of problems that can be solved when you're in that situation, as opposed to having a data set available to you that you'd like to process. And one particular family of those algorithms is called Q-learning. The broader category of approaches is known as reinforcement learning, and that's what we'll be focusing on today. So in terms of artificial intelligence, let's first discuss what is artificial intelligence. So that's a tricky question, because we haven't really ever defined even human intelligence particularly well. We take quite a pragmatic view of artificial intelligence. There's typically two streams of views on it. There's the people who try and create human-like intelligence. That's what we call strong AI. And then there are those of us who aren't too concerned as long as whatever process we create is able to improve over time without too much human oversight. We're satisfied. And that's a sort of weak AI approach, which is the one that's enjoyed a lot of success in the last 20 or so years. AI goes through various ups and downs, periods of overexcitement followed by realizing that it might be good for certain problems, but it's difficult to generalize. And then there's typically a crash in funding for AI that happens afterwards. They've been called variously the AI winters. So at the moment, we're still in an AI summer, which is nice. And the tools that are being used are very useful because of the environment that we're in, where a lot of data is suddenly available because of increased activity on the internet and so on. So some of the still weak AI techniques perform very well if they've got lots of data to work with. So it's still in the good days, but hopefully just brace yourself. Is that these techniques are not perfect. We do not have a general solution for intelligence at all. We don't even have a general definition, let alone a solution. So we will run into cases where these techniques do not work well, and there will be a contraction in funding again. Well, there might be. Data suggests it. Historical data suggests it. So just bear in mind that there are limits. But does it matter? And the question is, can we make computers that think? And the answer is, well, probably not, but does it really matter? Because the question of whether a computer can think is no more interesting than the question of whether a submarine can swim. The point is that it gets the job done. So this is Edgar Dijkstra, the inventor of Dijkstra's algorithm, which handles a lot of the routing on the internet, so shortest path algorithm for graphs. So you may have heard of him before if you've done any network related or graph theoretic work in the past. So what is intelligence? So we're not super sure, but it's definitely a bulk property of matter. So certain kinds of matter under certain very specific conditions exhibit this set of behaviors that we call intelligence. What is it, and under what conditions does it arise? It definitely can arise. There's intelligent matter in the universe. You are intelligent matter. But your individual particles are not intelligent. So it's an emergent property. It's something that arises due to the interactions of matter under certain conditions. So it can be a little bit difficult to define. And if you take an overly reductionist approach, where you split everything down to its smallest components, at some point it stops existing. So reductionism, as you should know, I think most of you would be science or engineering students, it's widely used in the sciences. I mean, we're very interested in what the fundamental properties of matter or information or various processes are. How small can we break things down before they stop making sense? And can we rebuild the large-scale observable properties that we saw before based on our understanding of the very low-level fundamental interactions? So it's incredibly useful. And in computer science, we use it all the time because we would like to take complex problems and break them down into simple problems, solve those simple problems, and combine those solutions into a working solution for the larger problem. So we say in computer science that a problem is reducible to another problem if there exists some computationally feasible method for translating instances of the one problem to another. So routing messages on the internet, that's hard. Finding shortest paths in a graph is less hard, but still not trivial. But by solving that problem, we can help solve the larger problem. So in the 20th century, particularly the mid to latter 20th century, a lot of thought was focused on what intelligence is fundamentally. And so there's a growing school of thought that intelligence is fundamentally a computational process of some sort, based on what we've learned about how intelligent organisms like various animals work, and even non-animal intelligences that we find in nature, things like slime molds and things. There seems to be some sort of computational process going on, be it chemical, be it electrochemical, or whatever. So it does seem to be computational. So it's possible, perhaps, if this is true, to reduce a set of intelligent processes into a computational set of computational processes. But there's no guarantee that those small, low-level computational processes will be intelligent by our definition of intelligence. So one of the founders of AI, Marvin Minsky, wrote this book called The Society of the Mind, where the idea was that the interactions of fundamentally unintelligent processes or agents create an emergent intelligence through those interactions. And the thesis was that this is what happens within people. Low-level unintelligent processes that are fundamentally computational interact to create at a larger level the property of being intelligent. And we see this in nature all the time. So, I mean, we largely consider living matter to be different from non-living matter somehow. We can say that an organism is alive with a reasonable amount of certainty, but if we look deep into it, eventually it's just chemical processes which we couldn't by themselves say that they are alive. And then, of course, there are a bunch of replicative processes that sort of straddle the border of life and non-life, things like viruses, which have some of the properties of being alive, but lack some of the other ones. So depending on your exact ontological categories, they may or may not be alive for your given purposes. So biologists, for example, still mostly don't consider viruses to be alive. But if you look at someone who takes a more information theoretic definition of life, they would pass those tests. So anyway, so you can still study emergent phenomena rigorously. For example, in engineering, you can study fluid dynamics. You can see how air and water and other liquid or gas or liquid-like things behave, even though wetness isn't a fundamental property of matter. There's no one molecule that's wet, but collectively they behave in such a way that they act as though they are wet. So if we look at intelligence like that, you can really say that artificial intelligence is more about either fundamentally modeling the low-level processes or replicating the higher-level processes. So you can say, how well do these different approaches work? And you can measure them against some known standard of an intelligent behavior, such as a human being, which tends to be the goal of strong AI. For example, creating systems that can fool humans into thinking they're intelligent. If they can do that absolutely consistently, then they are intelligent to all intents and purposes. Or you could break it down into something more manageable, the concept of rational behavior as opposed to necessarily definitely intelligent behavior. So that's generally the approach that's largely followed, is this idea of rational behavior. Rationality is about making the best decision given limited knowledge and also limited time in which to come to that decision. Since intelligence is a computational process, computational processes take time and energy. You don't have infinite time and energy to make a decision. So you need to make a balanced cutoff, a compromise between the limited data that you may have, the limited time you may have to make a decision, the limited energy budget you might have to make it, and then pick the best of a set of possible actions to take. And that we can say is rational behavior. So as I indicated earlier, early attempts to define intelligence were to measure it against a known standard. And the most famous of those was done by Alan Turing. There was a movie with Benedict Cumberbatch about him not too long ago. Groundbreaking mathematician and computer scientist, one of the first in the early mid-20th century, helped end the Second World War by helping to break the encryption of the German submarines. And his test for intelligence for the system was intelligent is what is most famous for, which is known as the Turing Test, which is basically if it can, under controlled conditions, consistently fool people into believing that it's intelligent, then it may as well be intelligent. That's basically taking something known as the polite convention and extending it to non-humans. So basically, the polite convention comes from the fact that, technically speaking, strictly speaking, from the only thing you know that's intelligent in all of the world, or that actually even exists in all of the world, is yourself. That's the only thing you can directly experience as being alive and intelligent. Everything else behaves as though it's intelligent, but you're not sure. It's a philosophical position known as solipsism. It's typically considered to be the worst case, lowest form of philosophical viewpoint, because it's literally saying I can only directly experience myself, so I only know that I exist. So for that reason, we tend to not want to focus on a solipsistic worldview. So what we do is we extend this convention to other beings, like let's say other humans, where we assume that they are like us, that they have an inner life, and that they act based on information that they know, and that things that they know may not be known by myself or others. This is known as the theory of mind, and children develop this at a very early age. Sometimes they test children to see how far they are developmentally by seeing whether or not they know that a secret told to them isn't immediately known to someone else. So basically it's taking that idea and extending this polite convention to non-humans. If they act intelligently, consistently, their external behavior is intelligent, then they may as well be intelligent, because for all you know, nothing is intelligent except you. So basically, it's as I said, it takes the form of interacting with the computer in a controlled way, typically through a text interface, and having a conversation on any topic for a given amount of time, and then doing that in parallel with lots of participants and seeing if it can consistently fool them into thinking that it's intelligent. Now, in modern times, with the sort of rollout of automation and interacting with effectively Eliza style chatbots that are trying to fool you into thinking that they're intelligent, either to scam you or as first level customer support or things like that. Turns out that people are more likely to fail the Turing test than computers are to pass it. There's this thing known as the Eliza Effect, named after one of the simplest, earliest chatbots, that people have a bias to projecting intelligent behavior and motivations onto non-intelligent things. So for example, the weather is out to get you because it's been raining every time you've wanted to go on a picnic or something like that. We have this innate bias to projecting motivations onto non-living things. I guess because the penalty for doing that is much lower than the penalty would be for not imposing motivations onto something that is actively out to get you. So we have a slight bias to thinking that things are intelligent even when they're not. So the Eliza effect comes into being more often than things actually could pass the Turing test. But if you want to look at it from a sort of programming point of view, and as far as I understand, the bias towards programming environments for this module is Python, or at least it certainly will be in this particular session. If you know how Python handles the types of things, it does that using a technique known as duck typing, where if something behaves in a certain way, it is that thing. So you can think of intelligence as being a duck typed property. If something behaves intelligently, then it is intelligent. Some people really focus on the low-level fundamental interactions of the one known general intelligence that we have, which is human beings. So they look at the organ responsible for intelligent behavior, namely the brain, and its fundamental units, the specialized cells known as neurons, and they model how they interact and try and see if by throwing enough computational processes at simulations that model these fundamental units, can we create something brain-like that then behaves intelligently. That's known as the cognitive modeling approach to AI. That's very interesting study or field of study, because it's an intersection between computer science and psychology and biology, and it tries to create testable theories regarding the underlying nature of human thought. And at the moment, for what it's worth, what we're doing is we're still just modeling very small collections or very simplified versions of these neurological cells, of these neurons. The real human brain is a very complicated structure where it's not just individual neurons acting together in networks, it's regions of the brain communicating over time, and these communication patterns changing over time. The image that you see to the right is of what's known as the connectome, which basically models how different localized regions of the brain talk to each other under different sets of circumstances, and the more frequently communication occurs, the brighter the color. So you can see in the middle here a very bright patch of tissue. This is the corpus callosum, which connects the left brain and right brain. A lot of human organ systems have bilateral symmetry, as you know. You've got two lungs, you've got two kidneys. While it's one organ, your liver has lobes, 2 feet, 2 hands, 2 eyes, all of those things. The brain follows the same pattern. It's got 2 separate hemispheres, which wind up specializing for certain tasks. The sort of broad generalization of left-brainedness and right-brainedness is nonsense, but there are certain regions that are more likely to occur, and specialized behaviors that are likely to occur on either the left or right-hand side of the brain. And of course, like with all of these chiral symmetry things, you do get people who will have all of those structures on the other side of the brain, just like you'd have left-handed and right-handed people. So it is interesting, but it is much more beyond where we are at the moment in terms of neural network style computing. And just to make you maybe have an existential crisis, and I've always believed that you should start every day with an existential crisis. It's as important as a cup of coffee. There's a surgical technique where this connection between the left and right brain is severed, known as a corpus callosectomy. It's often done for people who have very severe epilepsy, to stop seizures in one hemisphere from migrating to the other hemisphere. And what effectively happens in those cases is the two parts of the brain largely run independently. And there's a bunch of interesting videos you can look at online of people who've had this so-called split brain surgery, where one half of their brain knows something and the other half kind of does but doesn't. So you can show them a picture to one eye, because each brain hemisphere controls different parts of the a different side of the body, and ask them to draw something with the other hand, and they'll randomly draw something, but they won't know why they drew it, and it'll match the picture, but they won't be able to tell you why. So you say, why did you draw a duck? And they say, oh, I just felt like it. Because a large chunk of what the brain does is it lies to itself. It's known as confabulation, because the purpose of the conscious mind, or the purpose of the brain for your lived experience, is to justify and explain the actions that it's taken so that it can take similar actions if they paid off in the future. So lying to yourself about the reasons why you did something is actually evolutionarily beneficial. And that's why we do it all the time. Other techniques are focused on formal logic, based on sets of logical axioms, givens that you are the fundamental units of your system of belief, and then using strict logical rules to extend those axioms into rules that are useful in the general real world. This was the earliest approaches to AI that were taken based on formal reasoning, and they tend to work very well in very limited problem domains that are themselves fairly logical, but they tend to break down when it comes to interacting with the real world, because the real world is messy. Our measurements of it are difficult. The actions we take don't necessarily have the effect that we want. There's a lot of complex dynamic processes where the end results of something are very difficult to model computationally. So it's not the one solution to creating AIs, although it was the first, the sort of symbolic logic approach. It's helpful, but it isn't the only solution. So as we said, we sort of take a middle ground in a way. We try to create these small, unintelligent, but rational processes. And hopefully, if we are interested in creating more strong, generalized intelligence, that the interactions between these unintelligent processes might exhibit these emergent behaviors. And this is the system of intelligent systems development known as multi-agent systems. So basically, you create these individual, computationally separate programs, or they can be physical devices as well, called agents, and they are embedded in an environment, and they interact with the environment, which evolves either on its own or as a result of their actions. Excuse me. So the important thing about an agent that differentiates it from other ways of isolating elements in a modular software design is that an agent has autonomy. So there's a lot of ways to build chunks of software. There's libraries, and there's service-oriented programs, microservices, and so on. But the thing that differentiates an agent, or objects and object-oriented programming, the thing that differentiates an agent is it has the ability to select which of its set of behaviors it's going to undertake. The mechanism for mapping the state of the environment and the things that it can perceive onto an action that it chooses can be arbitrarily complex or simple. But that's what makes an agent an agent. It's the ability to choose its own behavior that it will undertake. So yeah, so various fundamental building blocks for for intelligence, philosophical ones about the nature of mind versus matter. So if René Descartes, for example, or Descartes, what is knowledge? How does knowledge lead to action? All of those things. Because we now think that intelligence is a computational process, computational processes are fundamentally an aspect of mathematics. All of computer science is really a kind of applied mathematics. So what would the formal rules be that you need to draw valid conclusions, logical reasoning? What can and cannot be computed? We've learned in the 20th century that not everything can be solved computationally. In fact, the 20th century was a pretty bad time, or good. It was an interesting time for mathematics. They started the 20th century trying desperately to build a fundamental, solid basis for all of mathematics on things like set theory or formal logic. And then it was proved by Gödel that any system that's complex enough to do simple arithmetic will have things inside it, sentences, expressions in it, that can't be validated by the rules of that formal system. This is known as the Gödel's Incompleteness theorem. And it applies to computer science as much as to the rest of mathematics. So there are certain things that cannot be computed. Simple things like creating a general algorithm that can tell if another algorithm will stop or not, creating a perfectly optimizing compiler. These cannot be done fundamentally based on that nature of mathematics. So everything needs to be pragmatic. You'll never get a perfect solution. So you need to come up with compromises that allow you to reason about uncertain information with uncertain computational processes, with unclear effects of your actions, to try and take the best possible course that you can. Been people trying to build on the basis of neuroscience, on the basis of higher level behaviors in humans, psychology, trying to build more efficient computers to try and realize our goal of artificial intelligence as much as possible. Understanding the nature of language and how it relates to thought. There's some schools of thinking that posit that language is fundamental to the nature of thought. People like from compiler construction and politics, his name is escaping me at the moment, but who basically believe that humans have an underlying universal grammar that allows them to understand language. And it's this mastery of language that differentiates humans from other non-human intelligences. We now know, of course, that things like cetaceans, like orcas and dolphins, do have some kind of language that they use to communicate with each other in different languages in different regions. We don't quite understand how complex these are and what kinds of concepts they can convey. So it's not unique to humans, but the idea that language is a fundamental part of an intelligent process is a theory that's out there. I don't buy it. I'm one of those people who don't have an internal monologue. I don't think in words. So I don't believe personally that that language is deeply connected to intelligence. It's a way of communicating concepts and maybe reasoning through them, but it's not the only kind of intelligence. And I'm basing that on my personal experience. So in any case, that brings us to rational agency. So agency's got a bunch of different meanings, but it basically means something that can act. We use the term agent in normal daily terms, where you have something that acts on your behalf. And in computer science, we have that idea for agents, things that do things for you. So if you're selling a property as a human person who owns property, you might have an agent that represents your interests in that transaction. If you're a particularly talented sports person, you will have an agent that represents you in negotiations. You are what's known as the principal, the person who's being acted on behalf of. They are the agents, the things that act on your behalf. And we have that in multi-agent systems as well, the idea that people would be shadowed by a bunch of intelligent agents that would act on their behalf, reading your intentions to do things like arrange travel for you or adjust environmental controls in a smart home or things like that. And we're starting to get there with things like Alexa and Google Assistant and Siri and so on. But as you know, those are still very primitive and have quite a long way to go. Interesting things that will come into dispute and need to be resolved in legal cases and so on will be, once these things have a fair amount of autonomy, but make mistakes, and they will make mistakes because, as I've discussed before, computational processes are limited and time is limited and information is limited, so they will make suboptimal decisions. If an agent, a piece of agent software, makes a poor decision on your behalf, how liable are you? And that will need to be decided on and built into the contracts that govern those systems. But in general, that process is known as the agent principal problem, to distinguish the actions taken on behalf of the principal by the agent. So yeah, we use also the term agent for things that really aren't intelligent. For example, the back end of the email system, the systems that hand mail from one server to another once you have sent it using your clients such as Outlook or web browser-based things such as Google Mail, are known as mail transfer agents because they act on your behalf, even though what they're doing is purely rule-based. And also things that carry out searches on your behalf when you search for things on the internet, known as search agents, and things that index for the search agents, the web crawlers. Those all act semi-autonomously, but on behalf of something else. So the field of agents has also been used widely in things that aren't computer science. So economics has had this idea of an economy being made up of a bunch of completely self-interested, completely rational actors known as agents that always try to maximize their well-being by making profits. So they basically viewed economies at the larger scale in macroeconomic terms as being these emergent systems based on the underlying interactions of these economic agents. And this is actually really close to how we use the term in computer science. So basically simulating complex behaviors through the interactions of simple agents. And to be honest, in the early days of macroeconomics, they would generalize these behaviors or sort of take a high-level formula that would represent the final outcome of these interactions, large, high-level macroscopic equations, because it would be too difficult to simulate an economy with actual individual actors. But now, with the emergence of widespread, cheap computational power, it is possible to now simulate economic agents on a very fine-grained level. So the one key factor that differentiates an agent from another kind of software system, as we said, was its autonomy. It can select its own actions. But the other thing that's really distinguishes an agent from other more general AI systems, such as expert systems, is that it's embedded within an environment, and it takes actions on the basis of the state of the environment, which may wind up changing the environment. And these changes may or may not be beneficial from the agent's point of view. So that interaction between the agent and its environment, and the changes in the environment triggering changes in the agent behavior, triggering changes in the environment, creates an interesting dynamic system, which only becomes more complicated when you've got multiple agents interacting via a shared environment with different goals, changing the environment in different ways. So this notion of being embedded within an environment is incredibly important to the idea of an agent. So as we said, we're going to try and create agents that are rational, that take the best choice based on the information they have and the time that they have in order to evaluate that decision. So this is the idea of specifically bounded rational agency. Rational agency is just taking the best decision based on the things that you've observed in the environment, which we call the percept sequence, and basically limited by how accurate your model of the environment is and how it will change on the basis of your actions. Bounded rational agency further adds the constraint that you do not have infinite time to evaluate the possible consequences of different actions taken by yourself or other agents in the environment. So you have to pick a cutoff and take an action because otherwise you'll be paralyzed forever, never moving, never acting. So formally, a rational agent is something that for each possible sequence, it will select an action that's expected to maximize its performance measure, given the evidence provided by its percept sequence and whatever built-in knowledge the agent has, a priori knowledge that it already has about the environment and its evolution. What we'll do in our worked example is we'll start off with very little to almost no knowledge of the environment and what consequences actions take. And we will build up our understanding of the environment by acting on the environment. So agents are modeled as follows. They're sort of black boxes with input coming in as a percept sequence via sensors. These can be purely software, of course, and actions being taken by way of actuators. So things that are going to have an effect on the environment. So we typically represent this as a three-tuple of the agent, its percept sequence, and the available actions that it can take. But the interior model of this agent function that maps a percept sequence onto an action selection, obviously that can be implemented at various levels of complexity. So at the simplest possible level, there's something known as a reflex agent, which, I mean, even intelligent systems like humans have this inside them. It's silly to think we would only build a complex system out of one kind of agent using only the most sophisticated techniques. You as a human being have reflexes, which are decisions that you take, but they never hit your conscious mind. In fact, they might not even make it to your brain at all. So for example, if you touch a hot stove, by the time it reaches your spine, a decision has been taken to move your hand away to avoid damage. You have no control over it. It never reaches your conscious mind. And we call that a reflexive behavior. In fact, by the time it reaches your brain, you might feel that you took a decision to move your hand away. But that's a lie, a confabulation your brain has made up. Oh, it was hot, therefore I moved my hand away. Before the pain had even reached your brain, you were already moving your hand away, because there is no time to deliberate on whether we should move our hand away or not. It's proved advantageous biologically over time to make these decisions as quickly as possible. So that's what we do. We've got a set of condition action rules, and as soon as a condition is met, a decision is taken to take that particular action in the environment. So it's a very simple mapping. Now, obviously, the world itself is complex, and your reflexes are sort of baked in. They are the process of the result of an evolutionary process. You're not going to change your reflexes during your life. They will stay there. I mean, obviously, you could damage the nerves, or you could damage your ability to act, but the actual reflexive behavior stays. It'll only change over generations of selective evolutionary pressure. So the other decisions you make are based on some idea about how the world works. And they can still be pretty reflexive in the sense that there's a set of fixed rules that you'll take, but they'll be based on your understanding of how the world will change based on something that's going on. So for example, you're cooking, and instead of burning yourself on the stove, now there's a grease fire. That needs to travel to your brain to make a decision, but you're not going to sit there analyzing the moral consequences of putting the fire out or taking some action. You'll very quickly take an action based on what you perceive and your understanding that a fire will change and spread. So it's still reflexive, but there's an understanding of the world and how it changes over time, and you will then pick the world state that you expect to be best, but you won't have any deliberation about how that picking happens. That'll all be hard-coded. The next step is, of course, to then say, well, I've got a set of possible actions I can take, and some of them will be better than others according to some metric. That's a utility-based, model-based agent. So again, you'll sense the world state, you'll predict how the world will evolve on the basis of your model of the world. You will see, of the set of actions I can take, what will they do to the world? And then of these possible world states that result from my understanding of the world's evolution, which is best for me? Now, best is a term that it's fuzzy. What is best? So you'll need to have some sort of function that will evaluate a world state and give it a sort of fitness or utility value, saying how good these states of the world are. And then you will pick the best, or from a set of equally best actions, the one that works well for you. We'll discuss that sometimes you tweak this a little bit, and in fact, the one we'll implement will tweak that a little bit, because you sometimes don't always want to take the best action. If you have some uncertainty about how the world works, you need to spend part of your time exploring the rules of the world and part of your time picking the best action. So that balance between maximizing utility, and picking actions that pay off needs to be found. So the utility function, this is where the AI in such a system is embedded. How do we measure the goodness of an environment? And also in the world evolution, how does the world change based on our actions and its own internal evolution? So that's where the intelligence would be embedded in those functions, the model of the world and the utility function. So you could, for example, if you have the grease fire, decide to try fight the fire yourself, at risk to yourself, but maybe saving your family. You'll have a utility function that will measure your well-being versus that of your families. Some people's will be different. Some people will just run away straight away and not give a second thought to anything else. So there's no absolute correct answer to what action should be taken. It's all based on what the utility function says the values for things are. Now you can sort of abstract that even further and say, not just based on the current set of outcomes, but I will have some sort of long-term goal about how I want the world to be. And maybe actions I take now will be less beneficial, or the world will be in a slightly worse state now. But my understanding is that by taking a series of these actions, I can actually lead the world to being in a state that I would very much like, according to the fitness measurement of the world. So this basically allows us to have long-term plans or goals that we would like to reach. And we can take suboptimal decisions now if we believe that they lie on a path that leads us to a world state that matches our goal. So we call that a goal-based agent. You can see it as an extension of a utility agent. But all of these sort of have hard baked into them this idea of the world evolution. How does the world change based on its own rules and the effect of my actions on the world? So all of that's already built in. The only thing that comes in is the percept sequence. So if we take it to its absolute extreme, we have what's known as a learning agent, where its knowledge of the world is limited or non-existent. It might just know what possible actions it can take, but have no clue as to what effect those will have. And by taking actions, it will see what effects those have, and it can measure the goodness of those just with like a utility function or a goal aligning function previously, seeing how well it's doing according to some metric. But it needs to basically criticize its actions. You can build that into the performance element if you want. And it also needs to generate new learning opportunities. So this is a problem generator. So strictly speaking, in this utility one, you will always pick the vector. This isn't a learning utility agent, it's just a regular utility agent. But in a learning utility agent, you must sometimes pick the worst option. Over here, the only time you'd have a set of possible actions would be if you've got a set of equally good trade-offs. And this happens quite a lot in situations where you're trying to maximize a bunch of different goodness measures. So we call that a multi-objective environment. So that can happen where doing something, like for example, let's say you're negotiating salary, and you have to balance the risk of losing standing with your employer, or in some environments, your employment itself. You have to balance the risk of not acting and then being paid less than what you're worth. If your goals aren't being met, then you have to weigh up your options in terms of what actions you take. Do you find another job? Do you take some industrial action of some sort? And some of these will have different trade-offs, different levels of risk that are acceptable. And the set of all of those actions that seem to pay off equally, but for different reasons, we call the Pareto optimal front. So it's a bunch of equally okay choices that we could make. Important thing to point out, this idea of Pareto optimality is sometimes used in the context of evaluating things like fairness. So where you need to make a bunch of decisions about, let's say, to allocate a resource. But the set of Pareto optimal choices isn't the same as the set of fair choices. So something's Pareto optimal when there's at least some benefit for making change. So you basically keep tweaking the different choices you make, and as long as there's some benefit, that's good. And then you'll reach a point where any tweak will result in a lesser goodness value, whatever that might be. So sometimes people confuse this idea with fairness, because in the context of fairness, you can express the problem as, I want to take a decision that will benefit at least one person and harm no one. And that sounds pretty good, but you quickly realize that it's not the same thing as fairness. So if you've got, for example, a situation where you've won the lottery and you're fine, you don't have any money problems. So you want to help the world, you're going to give this money away. So you do, and there's 100 people you could help. So you could spread that money evenly amongst them, that's fair. Or you could just give all the money to one person for no reason. One person has benefited, they've got all the money now, and no one has been hurt in the sense that they're just as bad off as they were before. You've done a Pareto well, you've improved it in a Pareto optimal sense. It hasn't reached its equilibrium yet, but you have taken a decision that benefited one person and harmed no one, but it's not the same thing as being fair. So there's something to think about. So I guess let's take a look at the agent environments. Agents are these entities, they're embedded within an environment. The environments differ from each other. Formally, you can represent these environments as n tuples, basically, where you have different characteristics of the environment. So environments have these characteristics known as observability, multiplicity, predictability, dynamism, and whether or not it's continuous or discrete. So you can represent all of those as a 5-tuple. Yeah, as a 5-tuple. So observability basically says, how well can we sense the environment? Basically, how accurate is our percept sequence in conveying the overall state of the entire environment? So in most cases, you won't have full observability. You'll only have partial observability because of, if you're interacting with the real world, sensors aren't perfect. If you're even if it's a purely virtual environment, if it's computationally complex or it's real time, then you might not have full information about what's going on. If you look at it in terms of games, a fully observable game would be something like chess. You can see every piece in the environment. You know everything about what's going on. Whereas if you look at a game like poker or whist or poobah or something like that, where you have cards that you know but other people don't know, then it's partially observable. You know your codes, your cards, you know the cards that are displayed face up on the table, but you don't know what your opponents in the game might have. So for that reason, it's not fully observable, it's only partially observable. Are you the only agent embedded in the environment? We typically find multi-agent systems to be more interesting because it's the interactions between the agents that can lead to those emergent properties. But you can't say whether or not you're the only agent acting in the environment or not. Then not all environments behave the same way when you do the same thing. There might be some fundamental level of unpredictability, of stochastic behavior in the environment. So the predictability of the environment, how deterministic are the actions I take and the outcomes I get. You can represent that, for example, as a real value between 0 and 1. 1 being completely deterministic, every action always results in the same outcome. 0 being complete chaos, where there's no match between your percept sequence and your action selection. It doesn't matter. There's no way to behave rationally in such an environment if everything is pure chaos. So typically, most environments will be somewhere in the middle, hopefully tending closer to 1 than they are to 0, so that your actions can be as rational as possible. Then basically, not all environments are the same. Some environments, you take a decision now, and that doesn't affect the environment in a sort of permanent way. You need to make a decision now, take a choice, and then the next instance of the environment will be unrelated to the previous one. So for example, if you're a robotic arm and your job is to attach a bolt somewhere to a car that's being assembled, and the car should roughly be in the same position and orientation, but maybe due to error or whatever, it might be slightly different. So you need to basically figure out where to put the bolt, and you do, and then the next car comes along the environment, and it's the choice you made with the previous car doesn't affect your choices for this car. They're unrelated to each other. So that's an episodic environment, one in which decisions you make now change the environment, and those changes persist and affect future decision making, is known as a sequential environment. So it's basically how many repercussions there are for your choices. Obviously, reasoning in an episodic environment is much easier than reasoning in a sequential environment. And then we've got how does the environment change by itself without actions that you take? So the dynamic nature of the environment. So changes in humidity or temperature or whatever that might be unrelated to decisions you've taken. So obviously you put that on a spectrum as well, ranging from static, where the environment's always the same by itself, only changes in response to actions you take or that other agents take. For example, chess, or semi-dynamic, where the outcomes may affect an external metric, but do not otherwise have an influence, or fully dynamic, of course, where the environment does evolve on its own. For example, seasons change and so on and so forth. And then basically, based on how you perceive the environment, this can be a bit confusing when you compare it with episodic and sequential, this notion of discrete and continuous environments. But basically, it's got more to do with how the agent is perceiving the environment than the actual fundamental nature of the environment itself. Do your perceptions of the environment arrive as a continuous feed? Does it feel like the agent is completely embedded in an environment all the time? Or does it simply get one snatch of information at a time? Now, strictly speaking, you're never fully embedded in an environment. Everything you get, in a sense, is discrete, because inputs only arrive in discrete packages. So even if you've got a real-time video feed, it's still made up fundamentally of individual frames in the video, which are effectively still images. Same for audio. You've got instantaneous intensity values that a speaker is picking up, for example. Over time, you can transform that into an approximation of a sine wave or a wave that's been modulated or whatever. But strictly speaking, the actual inputs are still discrete. So, but how you treat them, whether you wait for them to modify an ongoing representation of the environment or not, or whether you deal with them one frame at a time, one unit at a time, is whether or not your environment is considered discrete or continuous. But it's really more your perception. Now, for what it's worth, with humans, we have this feeling that we are a conscious entity embedded in a real-time environment, but it's not really true. It's a state that's created by your brain to help you pick actions that are beneficial. So your different senses act at different speeds. So, for example, computationally intense senses like sight is actually fairly slow. It only trickles into your conscious awareness fairly quickly. Whereas something like sound, it's easy to process. So it enters your conscious awareness very quickly. So there's a reason, for example, in races, why they use a gun to start the race rather than have everyone watch flags or whatever, or why if there's like a motor race or whatever, there's a sound that accompanies the change of the lights. You will actually perceive the sound before you've consciously registered the change in the lights or a flag or whatever, because sound is easier to process for your brain. But your brain sort of lies to you again and creates the sensation that you're experiencing everything at the same time. So it's a sort of lag between your conscious perception of reality and reality itself, and it's fairly long. It's like half a second or something. It's half a microsecond. It's fairly long in computational terms. But that's when everything sort of gets consolidated by your brain, and you get the sense that everything happened at the same time. When in actuality you acted and perceived on different senses differently. All right, and then your nature of the environment, is it known or unknown? How much do you understand about the environment at the beginning, or do you learn the rules of the environment as you go along? You can sort of summarize all of these when you're doing a design for a multi-agent system in what's known as a P's analysis, where you say, what are my performance measures going to be? What are the properties of my environment? what actions can I take and what inputs can I get from my sensors. So if you looked at something like a Mars rover, it would have various goals. It needs to safely move around, needs to conduct its experiments, needs to maintain contact, needs to be able to diagnose itself. The environment is dynamic. Mars has sandstorms and radiation that changes and days and nights and all sorts of things. It's partially observable because it only has limited sensors. It doesn't necessarily know everything about the environment. The environment is continuous. It's kind of predictable most of the time. And there's only the one Mars rover in any one place in time. So you can sort of treat it as a single agent environment. It can move things by activating various motors and servos. It can heat things up with heating elements. It can communicate with communication equipment. Conducting experiments could also be considered as an actuator. It's got various sensors, so radar, chemosensors, and tilt sensors, and temperature sensors, and feedback from its own equipment as well. So you could measure something like a Mars rover if you were designing it in early phases, break it up into those aspects of its design. So as I said, agents, I focus on software agents, but they can be hardware agents like a physical robot, or even biological, or these days even combinations of the three. If you really want to, it's possible to do horrible things to cockroaches. They've got very simple nervous systems, and turn them into robots quite easily by stimulating the various nerves in their ganglia, which is their simple nerve clusters. You can control their bodies quite easily. So very simple to make a bio-robot, a cyborg, if you want, out of something like a cockroach. And of course, people are now investigating things like embedding hardware into themselves to give themselves extra senses, things like magnetosense and so on. We're still very early days, but anyway, an agent can be implemented as a combination of hardware, software, and biology. We focus on purely software agents. And then if you are from a programming background, you can think of agents as being an extension to the object-oriented paradigm, and a sort of extra layer of abstraction on top of object orientation. So object orientation is a way of creating software systems where you combine the data and the operations that are legal on that data into a single entity and restrict your changes to the data by way of only those sets of legal operations. That's known as encapsulation. So we can add an extra layer to that in the sense that these operations, the choice of selecting which operation we're going to do, will be up to the object itself. That's adding the concept of agency or autonomy to the object itself. And if you've done that, you've got an agent, be it a very simple one, because those rules, as you've seen, can be as simple as a bunch of if statements for picking what action to take based on one single percept. So now we've built up our understanding of what an agent is, and we built up our understanding of what environments are. Let's take a look at how this relates to our concept of reinforcement learning, which is basically learning from the environment. So depending on how people split these things up, it's often considered a branch of machine learning, but it's a complex Venn diagram, more like intersecting spheres or hyperspheres than intersecting circles. So, but often people will group things into supervised learning, which is probably what you'll see most commonly, where we've got a labeled data set of values and what they mean, and we will build up some kind of a model of how the world works based on these pre-labeled observations. So the percepts, if you're looking at it from a multi-agent point of view, it'll say, given this percept sequence, what is the best action to take? And I could just feed a whole bunch of these percept sequences and correct action selections to a learning algorithm, and it will over time learn to approximate that data set as well as possible, i.e. picking the same action as the data set would suggest. And as you may or may not have learned yet, that you need to balance memorizing the data set, i.e. overfitting it, or keeping it general enough so that you extract the core principles of what the data suggests without just baking in a pure mapping between percept and action. If you overtrain an agent that's learning function is based on supervised learning, you've effectively converted it from being a learning agent into being a reflex agent, because it will always take the same decisions based on the same inputs, and will never, you basically made a very expensive set of if statements. Then you've got things like unsupervised learning, which in general, that normally, the most common kind of that you see is things like clustering, where you group related things together. But there's no prior knowledge of what's correct and not correct given to the algorithm. Supervised learning, a human being curated, if not outright curated, created the data set by labeling the observations and how good they were. So there needed to be that input from a human being or other intelligence system to creating the data set. Whereas unsupervised learning doesn't have that. You simply look at the properties of the data itself, and on that basis, you do whatever it is you're doing. Typically, as I said, it's clustering, so grouping them together, creating sets such that the observations that are in that set are more similar to observations within the set than they are to observations outside the set. We call those clusters, and there's no need for human input in advance, except maybe for some hyperparameters, how many clusters and so on, and various parameters that might tweak the algorithm, but nothing based on the data itself. And then we've got reinforcement learning, where we don't have a data set, but we have an environment. We can make choices in the environment, and those choices may or may not pay off. So psychology studied this quite extensively. The operant conditioning learning, they call it, where you have, for example, a rat in a cage, and it learns that pressing one button will activate the electric grid that it's sitting on, and the other one will dispense food, and very quickly the rat will learn to press not the electrocute button, but the food dispensing button. I think you can see that based on the image that these experiments were often done long ago. I think you can still do them, but definitely would require much more ethical clearance these days to do an experiment like that than it would have in the 50s. We've got humans do this to themselves all the while. They love to gamble, and they love to take actions that have unknown payoffs. In fact, one of the branches of reinforcement learning is built around this idea of gambling with these machines. They sometimes call them one-armed bandits, because the original one required you to pull a lever at the side, and it would take your money, so it's a bandit, and it may or may not pay off. So human beings fall for this all the time. And then there's been other experiments with things like pigeons and so on. We're teaching pigeons to recognize images and so on by rewarding them with food if they get it right. One interesting thing that they've done, this is a slight aside, is they've also had unreliable payoffs. So basically an environment that's a little bit stochastic, a little bit, or rather a little bit non-deterministic, where sometimes there will be a payoff and sometimes there won't, but it'll be biased towards being what the pigeon expects. But then they will couple it with some other signal. So for example, they will have a flag that will be in the up position, and in those times it's more likely to pay off for the correct answer, or a sound that happens at the same time. And then they will stop making it correlate, and the pigeon will learn basically superstitious behavior, and it'll learn that, oh, the flag is lucky, now I will get a payoff, even when that behavior is either long stopped or sometimes in cases never even was correlated. They'll learn these false correlations between something else in the environment and the payoff from their action selection that aren't correct. So this notion of superstitious behavior isn't limited to just humans. Other, even fairly simple by our standards, animals can learn ritualistic behavior. Humans do it all the time as well. Lucky pens, lucky seats in a casino or whatever, even if it's got no relationship to reality. That's because modeling these inherently random processes is difficult or impossible. So reinforcement learning, we go back to our learning agent design, and we will basically need to update it so that its performance element and learning element and critic, problem generator, reflects this idea that we will update our performance element based on observed improvements to the environmental state based on our actions. We will learn to select those ones more often, but some of the time we should still pick suboptimal options so that we can learn more. There's a balance between learning opportunities and maximizing our gain. And we should feed in possible negative feedback as well. So we've got this idea of the critic, the learning element, the performance element, and the problem generator all will be realized by the reinforcement learning approach. As I said, the process is emergent. You don't know how the environment works in advance. So you have to make a choice between settling into a nice, comfortable area of the problem domain and maximizing your rewards by exploiting that portion of the problem space, or do you want to wander around the problem space, seeing if other parts of it might pay off more than later. And typically you'll want a balance where early on you will explore more and then hopefully find good regions of the problem space and then settle in to exploit them. So this balance between exploitation and exploration of a problem space is very important in all learning algorithms and in reinforcement learning as well. We need to have some rule for spending part of our time exploring and part of our time maximizing the good solutions that we have found. So if you look at reinforcement learning, it maps very naturally onto the agent model and the notion of an agent function, because you've basically got this idea of mapping a percept sequence onto an action and you're embedded in the environment straight away. So the inputs to such a system would be the environmental state that you can sense, as well as the rewards payoff for actions that you take. So, and then the outputs from this machine will be the actions that you pick. And basically your goal, the inner workings of this black box or blue box in the case of this picture, will be to optimize a set of rules, a policy that will guide you in selecting an action in any particular state. So that policy will model your understanding of the environment and its payoffs so that you can pick good things. So key part of this, as I said before, is this idea of the rewards. So every learning agent will need to make use of some performance measure, as we've seen, which may need to be improved, whatever improved might mean. Some cases you're maximizing, some cases you're minimizing. So for example, if you're trying to make something efficient, you'll be minimizing maybe a loss function of some sort. Say you're optimizing an engine design, you want to minimize the amount of useful work that's lost to heat, for example. Or you might be wanting to maximize something. You're maximizing your payoff if you're, say, an economic agent that's trying to buy and sell socks. Yeah, socks would work. Stocks is what I meant to say, though. So how you do this optimization obviously varies depending on the nature of the agent. So if you've got, and what you call the reward function as well will also change depending on the nature of the agent. There are a bunch of learning algorithms that are based on natural selection, on Darwinian evolution. We tend to use the term fitness function to refer to the payoff in that case. If it's a utility-based agent, we tend to just refer to it as a utility function. If you're trying to minimize something, we'll typically refer to that as an error function. And sometimes you're trying to maximize things like information gain. Let's say you're trying to minimize, making a compression algorithm. So the compression algorithm will have a very high entropy in its output, in the sense that there's nothing you can change that will leave it the same, because every useless thing has been removed. So you might be trying to maximize some measure of entropy for a compression function, because that will correlate to how compressed something is.
Duncan?
And yes.
Apologies, there's actually a question in the chat. I'm not sure if you could maybe read it out.
Sure thing.
Answer.
Okay, is this the most recent one? Or, okay, that's a you. So does instant gratification become a problem in reinforcement learning, where the agent would take an action that would yield a reward in a shorter period of time, rather than delay a reward for possibly bigger payoff? And the answer is absolutely yes. Balancing how important a short-term payoff is versus long-term reward is something that's explicitly modeled in the Q learning approach that we're going to work through now. And this is something that humans are bad at. We're very good at maximizing short-term gain at the expense of long-term gain. We do this as individuals, and we also do this as societies. So one of the issues that we have, for example, if you look at politicians, they are biased towards maximizing short-term wins. Even like, let's say you've got a perfectly honest politician who genuinely wants to do the best thing for their constituents. They have a choice between taking something that's really detrimental now, but will pay off much later, like let's say 10 years in the future, or making a decision that will pay off only reasonably well now. They will be biased to take the short-term decision always, because their feedback cycle is the next election. So a politician, even one who knows that the long-term project is more important, will still have to maximize their chances of re-election so that they can hopefully guide policies in the ways that they think are best, even if they know that this long-term project is important. Let's say phasing out carbon creating energy production, but that's painful now, benefits are far away in the future, or doing something now to alleviate an energy crisis. One is going to benefit them now immediately, and the review cycle is short enough that that's the choice they will take, even if they're perfectly honest and have a good understanding of how the world works. And their only job in life is to improve the lives of the citizens. And I do think that you may be able to find at least one instance in history of a politician that did not maximize those other criteria. So even in the best case, there's a bias towards short-term gains, which is detrimental, unfortunately. So very good question, thank you. So in reinforcement learning, it takes the form of a reward function that maps the representation of the given environmental state onto a numerical value indicating the desirability of that state. So how good is this instance of the world as opposed to any other instance? So the rewards themselves, now we're going to start moving into how would I actually implement something like this. They should be a numerical value, something that we can compare, or it should be something that's at least orderable, something which has a total or partial order property. I can say that these things are better or worse than others. So numbers would be perfect because obviously you can totally order them, and that's great. So if we do work with numbers, we'll typically have them as being either positive or negative. So a positive reward or a negative punishment. It's best to do it with both, a combination of both positive or at least zero rewards for non-beneficial actions are needed. Otherwise, the system will, if it's just trying to maximize its reward over time, it can do that by taking a whole bunch of terrible short-term decisions that never pay off very well and just doing lots of them. So you either need to build into your reward function some punishment for the length of the sequence of actions it's going to take, or more simply, by simply punishing non-optimal decisions with a negative value so that it will bias it towards finding the shortest path to the largest reward. And here, leading into again, building on the point that was raised earlier, rewards may be short-term, long-term, or the cumulative result of multiple short-term rewards. In reinforcement learning, the goal is to maximize the expected value of the cumulative reward value. And you'll see the update function takes into consideration the fact that we need to balance knowable short-term rewards and long-term less knowable rewards. This picture, for what it's worth, is from the famous Marshmallow Experiment, where they do this to see how good children or people are at self-control. So they give the child a marshmallow and they say they can eat that now, or they can wait 5 whole minutes and then they get 2. And the theory is that children who were able to delay gratification, as in wait 5 minutes and then get 2 marshmallows rather than eat 1 marshmallow now and get no extra marshmallow, would be more successful in life. And so I believe the experiment followed them in later life to see how well they did. And I think it's been done several times. And I think in general, it says, yes, that delaying gratification leads to better outcomes. So I'm not a psychologist, so I can't speak to any methodological errors that might have occurred, but in general, my understanding is that the children who were able to delay gratification more had better life outcomes in the future. So how will we model our environment? Well, environment has obviously got a set of states, configurations the environment can be in, and ways to move between one state and another. So that's the dynamics of the environment. How does the environment evolve either by itself or as a result of our actions? We're going to keep it simple and say that the environment evolves only as a result of our actions. And then we need a representation of the rewards and the possible actions that can be taken in a particular state. It's not always the case that all actions are available at all times. Some environments you can only take certain actions in certain states, so that needs to be represented as well. Or you can represent all the actions but have incredibly massive penalties for taking impossible actions in a state that doesn't allow it. So finding cheese or moving by a mouse or moving a autonomous packing drone through a factory or something like that. So you can represent these states as graphs or tables, also known as finite state machines. This particular finite state machine is actually from a compiler, and its job is to try and recognize patterns. So you can use them for simple pattern recognition, or you can use them to represent environments. So if I'm in a given state, safe state, let's say this is actually from a vacuum cleaner, and its job is to wander around cleaning dirt as it detects it, and then charge when it needs to charge. And if it's damaged or in any way in peril, it needs to move away from the source of the danger. So you could represent that as a graph, as a sequence of transitions, or in biologically inspired AI, where you've got ants moving around, they may need to take one path versus another. So you'd have some sort of probability function that selects whether they will transition or not. So here, these transitions are labeled. So it could be probability based. So the chance of moving towards dirt is relative to how much dirt there is, or it could be a fixed rule, or you could have an explicit probability-based calculation for how likely you are to select a given action. So representing these transitions as graphs is useful, and sometimes if your choice of action is based only on the current state of the system, not on its previous states, then you can say that this system is memory-free. So I'm only going to base my decision on what the current environment looks like, not how it looked like before. If your system has such a state, it's got what's known as the Markov property, named after its discoverer, and you can represent your logic for how to make decisions as what's known as a Markov decision process, which is basically you've got a set of states, and you're going to transition between those states by selecting actions with the given probability. The weights that connect the edges in the graph represent how likely you are to follow those transitions. And the famous gambler's ruin problem is represented like that, where you've got some money and you transition between different states to represent how much money you've got. And then, you know, how long will it take you to do a random walk of bets from a starting stake to either winning or losing? You know, what do we expect the length of the path to be between those final states? So reinforcement learning agents must develop a model of the environment that represents the transition probabilities as closely as possible. You could represent this explicitly as a Markov decision process, as a literal graph data structure, if you wanted to, which may be useful, especially in scenarios where the outcome of an action is partially under the control of an agent and partially not. The transitions may occur at fixed time intervals. So if it's based on like a unit of time, a tick of a clock, or if it's a trading agent, a given trading session for a market when it opens or closes, or so on. And these time intervals can be single units, discrete values, such as trading times or whatever, or real time if you really want them to be infinitely subdividable, known as a continuous Markov decision process, which is obviously far more computationally complex than a discrete Markov decision process. So now we've got that understanding of what agents are, of what environments are, and of how we can model the state of the environment and transitions between states of the environments and the payoffs for different environmental states. That gives us to the high-level idea of what reinforcement learning would be about. So broadly speaking, you could represent it as a Markov decision process where you sense the current environment at time t to determine its state at that time. So S subscript t. Apply your agent function to map the current environmental state onto an action A based on your current policy. So your action at time t. Receive a reward for taking the action A at time t. That's your reward at time t, R subscript t. Transition to the next state at the next time interval, t+1, according to the dynamics of the environment. So that'll be your state in time t+1, so S subscript t+1. And then you've basically got two modes for your reinforcement learning. You've got the learning mode, where it's basically going to test the environment as many times as it possibly can and learn about the outcomes of its actions. So updating the reward table and the transition probability likelihoods based on those rewards. And then you'll reset the environment to its initial state and return to step one, and you'll loop through this as many times as you need. The question is, how long do you do this? Is a good question, and it's difficult to answer. Very often people will just pick some high number and train until they think they're done. But it's probably better to try and measure how much your rewards that you're getting are improving or not. So when your rewards that you get over time sort of level off and you're not getting any better, then you can sort of say that your learning algorithm has converged onto an optimal solution. Whether it's a local optimum or the absolute global optimum is difficult to say because it depends on the complexity of the environment. But you found a policy that pays off pretty well and you're happy enough with it, and then you can stop because it doesn't seem to be improving much. But either way, we'll do it simply and just do it for a fixed number of iterations, but you can be more sensible in how you implement your environment. So as I said, it's got two modes: training mode, in which case it's actually updating the rewards and transition probability tables, and then inference mode, where it simply follows the behavior or that the policy dictates. So you can say that in a sense, a learning agent, which is in inference mode, is in fact just a simple reflex agent, because the condition action rules are embedded in the policy and it's simply obeying those rules. So it learns in training mode and it simply obeys in inference mode. So you sort of think of what you're doing is you're learning the sort of payoff likelihoods as like a probability density function for picking the best action in a given environment. And this is best to keep thinking of it this way if the environment itself is not definitely guaranteed to pay off in the same way every time, but you still kind of want to pick the options that lead to the best outcomes most of the time. That's rational behavior. As I say, there's a big difference between rational behavior and what you would call clairvoyant or having absolute knowledge of the outcomes. If you are trying to cross the road and you look left and you look right and you cross the road and then a satellite falls out of space and hits you and you die, the newspaper headline tomorrow is not going to read "Idiot tries to cross road" because your decision was rational. It was perfectly based on the fact that you looked left and right and decided that the road was safe. So, you're just trying to increase the likelihood of picking up actions that lead to good outcomes. In fact, there's an extension of the one-armed bandit problem called the multi-armed bandit problem, which is nice and generalizable because basically anywhere where you're trying to make a bunch of decisions and pick a payoff that does well, you can represent those as arms of a multi-armed bandit that have different payoff likelihoods. Your goal is to learn which arm pays off the best. They use it a lot in things like auctioning and other processes where the payoffs aren't known in advance. So, as I said before, you don't always want to take the best action that you know about, because what's going to happen then is you'll find an okay action and then you will always pick it, and you'll never try something else that will lead you to learn more about other possible great actions you could take in the future. So this is the problem of exploration versus exploitation, and it occurs not just in learning algorithms, it occurs in search, it occurs in other optimization problems. It's a general property of computation, in a sense, that you need to balance these properties. They'll have different names in different contexts, but this is very rarely a situation where you will get an absolute benefit for one thing without sacrificing it another. So if you look at something like searching the one I want. Example eludes me, but in our case, we want to sometimes pick terrible options because maybe they'll actually pay off better than we think over time, because it's a cumulative outcome. It's the long-term payoff that we're interested in. So a simple approach to do this is known as epsilon greedy, where you basically got a threshold value called epsilon, and some of the time, most of the time, in fact, you keep that epsilon value very small. Most of the time, you'll pick your best option, but some fixed probability of the time, or proportion of the time rather, you will pick any of the legal actions that are available to you and see what their payoff is, and see how that leads you to other states that maybe in the long term will pay off better. So that's an example of reinforcement learning in general. Let's look specifically at the one kind of reinforcement learning, typically that of Q-learning. So Q-learning, explicitly agent-oriented. The agent is embedded in the environment, and it can make a decision on the basis of a set of context-specific actions. So basically, everything that we wanted from a reinforcement learning problem, Q-learning expects that in order to be applicable. It doesn't actually require a real model of the environment to be built up. It really just learns the payoff table for given actions and certain choices. But in a sense, that is kind of the model of the environment. So they sometimes refer to this as policy free, but it is still a policy in a sense, but maybe not an explicit representation of the environment, just the mapping between states and payoffs that we expect. We expect the environment to be episodic in order and to allow sort of consequence-free random sampling of the environment to allow us to build up an understanding of the environment and the consequences of actions. So let's say you were teaching a autonomous drone to move around a warehouse. You could do it at a very low speed so that collisions would not damage it in any way. And it could build up an understanding of what the layout of the environment is. Obviously, always build in sensors so that it doesn't collide if it can avoid it. And that it can randomly move around the environment in a sort of painless way so that it can learn what the layout of the environment is. And then you could ramp it up to a higher speed once it knows and is able to navigate more safely. So as an initial look, let's look at another way in which we can build up an understanding of the environment using sort of simple tests and very simple rules to improve our understanding of how the world works, or the payoffs of the world, if you want. So a broad family of these techniques are known as Monte Carlo methods, where you generate candidate solutions to a problem and measure on average how well they do against some fitness measure that embeds the property that you're trying to actually measure. So typically it'll be, we've got this thing that's hard to measure, or this value that's hard to understand, but we've got a simple test that ties into it somehow. And we'd like to do many repeated instances of this very simple test. And then on average, we should build up a better understanding of the more complex thing that we're trying to understand. So the very simple Monte Carlo estimate is to work out the value of pi using a very simple understanding of what a circle is. So as you know, the area of the circle is pi r squared. Pi is a transcendental, rational number, complex, scary, all of that. What if we didn't understand pi? And for most of human civilization, we didn't understand pi. So we're biased as people living in the present to think that our ancestors were stupid. They were definitely not stupid. They were biologically as smart as we are and living in conditions that were much more demanding than the ones we lived in. It's just that their understanding of the environment was less advanced. And luckily, humans can transmit that understanding between generations. So you may feel that you're more intelligent than these people who didn't know what pi is, but trust me, if you were born in that era, you might not have figured out pi yourself. So how could we figure out pi without really fully understanding pi? Well, one thing that's easy to do is to test whether a given thing is inside a circle or not. That's easy. If you do it by chucking darts or arrows at a circular thing, we could work out pi on the basis of whether they fell in the circle or didn't fall in the circle. So how good is a point at being inside a circle is a test we can easily do, and circles embed the property of pi. And so on the basis of measuring how good points are at being in a circle, we can indirectly come up with a measure of pi. So if we did this programmatically, we could say that we can measure the distance between one point and another point using the Euclidean distance measure, which is very simple. And in two dimensions, it's even simpler than that. This is for arbitrary numbers of dimensions. And then what we can do is we can say that a point is in a circle if the distance between that point and the center of the circle is less than or equal to the radius. So no notion of pi anywhere in our fitness value. As you can see, there's the formula for it. But we will simply test points that are in the circle and out of the circle, and over time come up with a measurement of how circular points can be. And the more samples we have, the better our understanding of circleness will be. Circularity. So, for example, throwing darts randomly at a board. So if we did this programmatically, so I'm not going to actually type this one in with you. We'll only type in the main Q learning one, so we can get started on that next. But this will just be an intro to it, but it's very simple. So for what it's worth, okay, as you may know, and hopefully do know, Python is a weakly typed language, or dynamically typed, or duck typed. The values are actually strongly typed. The variables are weakly typed. So the actual expressions have value, but the variables themselves do not. But there are extensions to Python that sort of add a veneer of type safety to it. And I tend to try and program with those extensions on because I prefer manifest typing, where the actual types that I expect are embedded in the code itself, rather than having to rely on the person reading the code, have a complex mental model of the different types that are involved with the values. And then also, though it's not particularly great, these libraries do allow you to catch some type-based errors programmatically. So I will program in that style, but you could leave all the typing stuff out. Python does not require it in any way. But in this case, what are we doing? We're having a function, the Euclidean distance function, that takes in 2 points. A point is a two-tuple, a pair made up of 2 integers. And then it will return a float, which is a real value representation. I decompose the points using structural decomposition into 2 separate variables representing the row and column values for those points. And then I simply perform the Euclidean distance calculation on those points, differences in the row components, differences in the column components, all squared, and then square roots of the whole thing to work it out. Technically speaking, if you were super worried about efficiency, you can compare relative distances by simply comparing the distances between the squared values, rather than worrying about square rooting them the whole time to get the actual distance. You can still see if one distance is larger than another simply by looking at the differences in the squares. And you may or may not, and probably will, see formulas that do differences in squares when doing these comparisons. It's used a lot, for example, if you're doing a neural network and you're trying to minimize the error function when you're doing something like backpropagation, and you do lots of comparisons, and you don't actually want to square root things the whole time, and you can actually skip it most of the time just by leaving things squared. So we could probably have gotten away with that, but let's do it exactly as the formula says. And then inside the main portion of our function of our Python module, we're going to, as I said, I'm going to just use a big number of evaluations. So what, 100,000 iterations of this process. And I'm going to generate random points, and I'm going to measure, are they in the circle or not in the circle? And let's say the circle has a radius of 1024. So it's very important to note that what that means is this, we're assuming that the circle is centered at the origin. In fact, I've explicitly mentioned that, and that its radius is 1024. So in terms of the area, what we're just doing here is we're working out things in the 1 quadrant of the circle. And so we need to multiply that by 4 to get the overall value of pi at the end. So all we do then is we count, are you inside the circle or not? and then divide the number of things that are inside the circle based on the number of iterations, and then multiply that by 4 to bring us back up to pi as a whole. And then you can see it's an approximation of pi. It's not great, but it's a really simple test using no pi whatsoever. And yet we've got a measure that's at least to a couple of decimal points, an approximation of pi. Obviously, we now know that you can approximate pi reasonably well with other easy to calculate calculations, but those are constants. Those are things we've worked out in advance. This is a process for finding out what pi is, based simply on an easy to test notion of how good a point is at being in a circle. So that's, you can look at Q-learning as an extension to Monte Carlo learning, where you add not just a measurement of how good a value is now, but also a measurement of cumulative payoff over time in a dynamic environment. So in a sense, Q-learning is built on top of Monte Carlo learning. So the building blocks of all reinforcement learning systems will have properties that you will see in a Q-learning system: action selection, input outputs, reward structure, embedding in an environment, and a Markov decision process. We won't explicitly need to represent that as a graph, but it'll be implicitly represented, because we'll basically have tables that will tell us when to move from one state to another. And this link of tables to tables will effectively, or entries to tables and to other entries in tables will effectively be the graph itself. You can represent any graph as a matrix, and a matrix is just a table. So we're going to represent it as a table, which is an easy to do representation. We'll have the training phase, the policy construction phase, which will have repeated engagement with the environment, balancing the exploration and exploitation payoffs. And then once we're done, we will infer the policy by following it. In fact, we'll do it manually. We'll have the learning process be automatic, and then we'll step through the decisions taken by our agent and see why it will be the right decision, simply based on the weightings that it will give the different actions we can pick. Q-learning is not perfect, so it's only really appropriate in environments where the number of states and the actions are finite, because you need to evaluate all possible states and assign values to all possible actions for each state. So if there are infinite number of states and infinite number of actions, this doesn't work, because it will take an infinite amount of time to evaluate them. So what is a Q-value? So why is it called Q-learning? So Q-value is basically a measure of the expected quality, hence the Q, of selecting a given action when you're in a particular state. The Q-values are an estimate of the final cumulative reward that you can expect if you follow an action in that state. And the Q-values will therefore get bigger as you get closer to the goal state. So if you want to look at it, you can actually look at Q-values as kind of like being a vector field in the set of possible states, biasing you to move towards states that are closer to the attractors in that vector field. So basically, these would be the goal states, or the set of optimal states, and the Q values will push you towards picking actions that will move you towards those goal states. As I said, we're going to use a two-dimensional representation of the environment. I didn't say that, but we will. Two-dimensional representation of the environment, and we'll therefore use a table indexed on the first state, and then secondly on the actions available in that state. But you can ridiculously easily extend this to multiple dimensions, because you're indexing, as you'll see, with a tuple, and that tuple could be an n tuple for all you want. So it really doesn't matter. And then once trained, the Q table is the agent's policy for selecting the best possible action. Q values are updated by, okay, so this is the heart of it. It's calculating something known as the temporal difference between the short-term reward that we've just received for the most recent action we've taken and the largest expected long-term reward according to the current policy and the Q value of the previous action. So basically, that's what's going to help us make potentially short-term poor decisions for long-term payoffs, because once the Q table is trained enough, the Q values will reflect the fact that even if in a particular state isn't best, it's on the path to best. So that's basically what it is. We'll also adjust the Q values by a parameter, which we'll call the discount factor. And basically that's just going to say how much we want to weight near-term rewards, as opposed, which we know well, as opposed to uncertain future rewards. So there's a certain amount of lack of observability if you look at the reward space as opposed to the environmental state. The environment will have completely observable, but a current action will have a payoff that's certain. You know for a fact what's going to happen, but you don't know, or you'll know reasonably well what's going to happen. But an action in a state that's far off, requiring many decisions between now and then, is much less certain, simply because the quality of our reward table might not be good enough to accurately predict it. So there's a lot of uncertainty in measuring the quality of future states. And there's much more certainty or future rewards rather, much more certainty on near-term rewards. So this discount factor will bias us one way or another. We can tweak it to say how greedy we are, in a sense, for current rewards, and how reluctant we are or pragmatic we are for future rewards. So this is the temporal difference function. So you can see we've got the reward from transitioning from our previous states. We've got this discount factor, which is lowercase gamma. We want to pick the best possible Q value from the current states that we're in. And we want to work up the difference between basically where we are versus the payoff we got from getting here in our previous step versus the Q values, the decision we made in the previous step to get us here. So this is the state we were in. How good was it? This is the state we're in now, or this is the state we're in now. What did we earn getting here, and how good are we now? That's basically what we're measuring. Is how much has the world improved or gotten worse based on the action we just took in terms of immediate reward, current expected reward, and what we expected the world to be like if we'd taken that action that led us here. And so that's summed up in this portion of this expression, the temporal difference expression, which we will then actually factor into our update function, which is basically now we will have another factor which we're going to bring in, another parameter to our system, which is going to be called the learning rate, which is basically how quickly we update our learning table based on the actions that we've taken. How quickly does information sink in? You might say, why don't we just keep that at 1 all the time? But sometimes having a value that's close to 1 means you're more willing to learn wrong things and less willing to forget wrong things. So typically you need to find a value between 0 and 1 that works well in your problem domain. What are the correct values for gamma and alpha? That is unfortunately problem space dependent. So you'd have to do a parameter study and tweak those values to find out which ones work well in your situation, unfortunately. Let's begin with our example. So we're going to do basically a maze finding example, and it's going to be an agent which will find its way to a goal in a maze. The picture is rats and cheese, but I'm going to do it with a robot trying to find its charging station. You could tweak that however you wanted. Up here. Right. Oh, sorry. There's just a few more slides you want to see as well. No, curses. Okay. So what is our reward table going to look like? It's going to have the same size as the environment, and we're basically going to have a penalty for taking an action that doesn't do anything. So it's just going to be a 1 point punishment. This is so that we can bias our program to take the shortest path. Moving into a wall is going to incur a 50-point punishment, and reaching the goal state is going to encounter 100 rewards. So sorry, it didn't, for whatever bizarre reason, my output was sometimes coming out in as a real number and sometimes coming out as an integer, so it doesn't line up nicely. But you can see the 100 there. That's the goal state. This corresponds to this particular version of the environment, where we've got our goal here and our agent there, and it's going to find its way to the goal. And let's begin. All right, so I'm going to make a new file. I'm going to save it. Like that's the okay, so Q learning agent.py. Okay, I hope the syntax highlighter should kick in now. So as I said before, I like to bring in some type safety into my Python programming, even though it's not really part of the language. It does. I find self-documenting code is beneficial, and the limited ability for it to help you find errors is also very helpful. So from the typing library, I'm going to import the data structures that I'm going to use, which are namely list and tuple. I must actually import them. Okay. I'm not sure how well you can see this, so let me just magnify it a bit. You can let me know if this helps you in any way. That should hopefully be easier to see. So I'm going to be loading things from the environment. From the that's a little irritating. No, well, hopefully you can see. From the operating system, I'm going to want to bring in the environments, because I'll be loading images for our outputs. Now, I'm going to modify, oh, no, sorry. I do this in order to set an environmental variable in the operating system, just to disable an annoying message that comes from the game engine I'm going to use to visualize things. It's an open source engine, but they tend to ask you to donate a lot. So I'm just going to turn that off. The way I turn that off is by setting an environmental variable called pygame hide support prompt, just because it's irritating, but do support them. They do good work. You just don't want to be nagged about it every single time. Then I'm going to implement this in an object-oriented manner, and Python does support object-oriented programming, kind of. Oh, it does, I mean, but just not as well as I'd like. So I'm going to again use an external library which will help improve Python's object orientation. So the thing I want to implement is something called an abstract base class, which is basically I'm going to use inheritance to represent different kinds of tables, because as you've seen, the Q-learning approach has different tables. So a table to represent the state transitions and tables to represent the Q tables itself. So I'm going to have a general table class, which I'm going to improve to be specific kinds of tables. So I'm going to import the ABC abstract base class library. I'm going to be doing some math, so I'm going to import math. I'm going to be bringing in the game engine. So that's pygame, but I might switch it at some point or whatever. So I'm just going to import it with an alias, import pygame as engine. We're going to be doing some random number generation. So let's bring in random. And then things can go wrong. So we're going to have some level of error handling. So I'm going to say that we're going to have the possibility of values being out of range. So I'm going to create an exception class, basically representing the kinds of problems that can occur. And I'm going to inherit from the exception base class. It's not going to do anything. I could add like error messages and whatnot, but I'm simply going to use the type hierarchy to represent the kinds of errors that occur. So range exception is a kind of exception. And likewise, also, we'll then say if the value is too small, that's a min range exception, which is a kind of range exception. But I'm not going to put anything inside it. So that, goodbye. And then I'm going to obviously have a max range exception as well, which is also a kind of range exception. Not going to put anything inside that. So there we go. So then I'm just going to have a simple little utility function which will enforce range. We'll take in an integer representing the value. Also because, as I said, I'm quite a big fan of implicit typing, so I will name my variables using Hungarian notation, where the type of the variable is embedded in the variable name as well as the explicit type signatures. This might be too much for some people. The sort of general Pythonic style is to not do this, but I program in a lot of languages and most of them are type safe. So my goal is to make my code more similar to me across multiple languages than it is to follow the style of one particular language. So you are free to not include the type names in the variable names or the explicit typing, but I find it helpful. So the actual minimum value and maximum value as parameters, and overall, I'm not going to actually have this return anything. I'm going to have this raise exceptions as it encounters them, so it's going to have no return type. And then, so if our value is too small, sorry, no square brackets, no parentheses, this is Python. So if int value is too small, so that means it's less than min. Oh, right, back to max. Then what are we going to do? We're going to raise a min range exception. So for what it's worth, when you extend exception, this is part of the reason I don't need to specify much. You by default get the construct or the init function that allows you to specify whatever you want. So I'm going to actually specify what the value was and why it was, and what the minimum that we expected was. So I didn't need to manually encode that into min and max range, but because they inherited that from exception, so that's fine. And then else, sorry, Python elif, if the int value is greater than the maximum, same story, except this time we will raise the max range exception. What was the value? What was the maximum that triggered that value? And that's fine. That's just a helper function I'll use all over the time. Typically as well, like I'm going to represent my actions as strings, I think. So, but I don't want to just refer to things manually as strings. I'm just going to create a type alias to represent strings as actions. So it does nothing. It's just a name, a rename, an alternate name for it. But then if I want to have an action represented as a string, I could do that by calling it an action. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a table. And this table will represent all kinds of tables. Specifically, we're going to need a Q table, and we're going to need a reward table. So one to represent the environment and one to represent the payoff matrix, basically. So I'm going to make a general table class to represent that, but I want it to be a proper abstract base class. So I'm going to use that library I brought in to improve the functioning of Python's inheritance. And I'm going to specify that this is inherit from the ABC abstract base class meta class. So sort of it's like a mix-in. It'll bring in some extra abilities, but make it behave more like what most programming languages mean by an abstract base class, which basically means if I don't implement all the functionality of the abstract base class in the derived classes, that's an error. And if I if I inherit from an abstract base from the table, the class that does the inheriting has a contract that it must implement all of the functionality. So a normal Python inheritance won't do that. So when we create our table, we need to define the init function for that. That's basically the constructor for it in other programming languages. All member functions of a class, all functions that are inside the class, must start with self, that represents the current instance of the table in this case. So then we can start talking about what parameters we want. So what parameters should we send here? I'm going to send the actual size of the table as well as the ranges. I'll default the ranges. I probably won't change them, but just in case you want flexibility going forward. So what dimension? I'm going to make that a tuple. And it's a 2 tuple containing 2 integers representing rows and columns, basically. I could have done a row and column value, but we're using tuples a lot, so why not? And then the actual range for the upper limits. I'm going to assume that the minimum limits are going to be 0. So I'm just going to need to specify the upper limits here. So we'll call that a tuple for the upper range. And that's going to be also a pair, a 2 tuple. And I'm going to give this a default. So we'll use structured decomposition. I'll say let's default this to 64 by 64. So that should be fine. So now let's implement the constructor. So all we need to do basically is do the sanity check to see if the ranges are correct, and then set up the empty table, whatever that table might be. The things inside the table will vary depending on what kind of table it is. A Q table will contain different things to the reward payoff table. But we're going to just put the basic skeleton of the table in place, and I'll implement the table itself as a list of lists. So basically every element in the outer list will represent a row, and then the inner list will be stored with whatever is relevant for that kind of table. So let's just enforce range for the first element in our two-tuple. That will be the rows, presumably. Doesn't really matter. Let's say it has to at least have some size. 0, you haven't got a table if it's 0 by 0, so let's at least say it has to be 1 by 1, and specify the upper range for that same dimension. So this will just basically crash the program with an error if it doesn't meet those logical requirements. Remember, in programming, you can only enforce requirements at different levels. So you can enforce requirements at the sort of type level for a strongly typed language, which Python, as I say, is kind of, because its values are strongly typed. But it's very easy to have an error in Python that only crops up much later on when a logical condition you had in your head is violated in code much later on. So it's always a good idea, if you can, to enforce your preconditions for your logic as explicit logical checks, so that the failure happens right there, so that you know, oops, I made the table with an impossible size, not later on when something goes out of range and you get a weird error at runtime. So, well, I mean, you'll get this error at runtime as well, but it'll be close to where the mistake was, which is what you want. So anyway, so we grab the next dimension, presumably columns, and then compare it, oops, sorry, with the upper range. That's position 1. So we've got our logical tests. Now let's, because I mean, the tuples are nice and all and whatnot, but we're going to be talking about rows and columns all the time. So I want to embed them inside my table. I don't want them to be this tuple floating around. So I need to store them. So I need to embed them as a data member into the instance of the table itself, the object itself. So I'm going to make an instance variable that I'll call rows, as well as one that I'll call columns. And I'll unpack them with the structural decomposition from the dimensions two tuple. So the first element will go into rows, the second one into columns, and I should be good from that point onwards. And now I just need to make the empty table itself. So I'll do that. I'll call that the space, whatever it might be. It's the reward space, or it's the state space, or whatever it might be. So I'm going to use a for comprehension to create it. At every element in the outer list, I'm going to have an empty list. So I said the contents of each entry in the table vary depending on the kind of table. I'm just making the skeleton here. And then for whatever, I don't care what the variable's name is, within the range based on the number of rows. So I'm doing row major order here. You could do column major order if you wanted. I'll typically do row, doesn't matter. So we're going to make the table on that basis. And it's an empty table, and that's that for the constructor. Just a whole bunch of useful, helpful things that all tables should have. If we want to access the rows, this is Python. You can drill right into the object and grab the rows and columns and space member variables directly, because Python has absolutely no notion of information hiding, which is not great. So we're going to add it. We're going to force it by making a property. A property in this case is going to be something that we can only read, and the way in which we want you to access rows and columns is by using this property, which is going to be a kind of function. So I'll call it rows. And it's a member function, so it gets self. And all we're going to do is we're simply going to return the underlying data member, and exactly the same story for columns. We want it to be a property. We want it to be called columns, and we're going to return self.columns. And then we'd like to be able to access things inside the column, inside the table. I'll let it be done in two ways, by using the indexing operator, as well as by using the function invocation operator. So basically, I'll say that if you access it via the indexing operator, you're going to send it a tuple. If you access it via the function invocation operator, you can send two separate variables. So I'm going to override those behaviors, which in Python, we do that for the indexing operator by overriding get item, which will take in, oh, sorry, it's get item, and it's what they call a dunder function. It's got a double underscore. So we're going to be overriding. So double underscore things are things that are known by the system in advance. In this case, objects will have a get item function method existing, which we can change. So that's why it's got double underscore. And I'm going to do this by coordinates, by a two-tuple. So a tuple of int and int. And it's just going to give us back a value at that point, which will make float. It's either going to be a transition probability or a reward value, so we can pick a type already. Going to decompose row and column from that coord. Check the ranges, because logical tests are always good. So is the row at least 0? Remember, the indexing in Python will run from 0 up to size -1. So although the smallest possible table is 1, 1, it's the lowest possible indices will be 0, 0. And likewise, the rows will go up to rows -1. And the columns will go up from 0 up to columns -1. So now we know that it's a legal coordinate. We will then reach into our table, and we will return self dot space at position row and position column. We'd like to also be able to set values. So we will override the indexing operator for modification. So that's set item. Also a member function. Again, take it in as a coord, just like before, as a tuple. Oopsie. But the actual value we want to set, which could be anything, so I'm not going to specify its type here, because in derived classes it might be different. And it's not going to give us any answer back, because it's what we call a mutator function. It's going to change a value, but not return a value. So it's going to give us back none. Same story as before. I want to grab, be very similar, except we're going to be modifying a value, not returning a value. So there we go. And then we will not return it, but instead modify self space at that position to store value. Okay, so we've got the ability now to store values, kind of. It won't actually work in the base class because there's no actual columns yet. That's the reason why we had to make this an abstract base class. So you couldn't just create a table that isn't a kind of table and then try reach into it with an illegal column value, because it would pass the enforced range checks, but they actually wouldn't be a value at that column index. So that's why we have to make this an abstract base class, that you can't just create a table. It has to be a kind of table, and the kind of table will sort out filling the details of the underlying space. All right, now we have, so I also wanted to allow you to access the values by row and column as separate values. So we'll overload the function invocation operator for that. That's basically the parentheses operator. We will then let you specify an actual row as an integer, an actual column as an integer, And we expect this to give us back a float. And then we can just reuse what we got before. So we can actually reuse the fact that we've already overloaded the square indexing operator and pass it to tuple made up of row and column, and that will reuse the safety checks that we've already done, so we don't need to repeat them, and that makes that life very simple. And then lastly, because very often you'll want to see a string representation of a table so that you can debug it. So you can see the output from this slide came from such a thing where I was debugging the string of the reward table. Didn't format it that well, but oh well. In any case, we will overload the string conversion behaviors. Now in Python, for whatever reason, there's two choices. There's the str function you can override, which gives you a string, and then you can also override the repr, the representation function, which also gives you a string. And there's a subtle semantic difference between the two, where the one is meant to be sort of human readable and the other one's meant to be serialized data for a machine to do something with. I'm going to overload the repr one. Because that's the human readable representation. I think, I can't remember which way around they want you to do it. In any case, that's the one we're doing. Okay, so we've overloaded the representation. We're going to be building up a string. I don't need to qualify its type because it'll get that type from its value. And I've named it so that it's understandable. We're then going to loop over every row and over every column. And we're going to get the string underlying proper string representation of whatever is at that location in the space and spit it out with an end of line or two. And then that's what our string is going to be. So for every row, this is Python, for every row, that's in the range of rows. For every column, that's in the range of the columns. Build up the table string by concatenating and appending the string representation of whatever is inside the space at the position row and column, and add an extra space after that so we can see what we're doing. And then at the end of every row is the end of a row, an end of a line. So once we've done that, we can then append to str table a marker for end of line. I'll do 2, small spaced out. And then at the end of that, we've built up our string. So we can return str table, and we'll have a string representation of our table and derive tables from it, because there'll be no need to override that behavior. And so then we can have particular kinds of table. So let's get into that. So we need two kinds of table, basically. We need the table representing the reward payoffs, which is the one you saw on that slide, and then the Q table, which kind of represents the environment and the expected payoff. It represents the environment by having the size of the environments embedded in it, so does the reward table, but it also represents the environment in terms of the actions that are that you take at that point. As I say, Q-learning, like whether you should call this a policy or not, I guess is, it's not an explicit representation of the environment or anything, but it is a mapping between actions and action selection, between inputs and action selection. So, you know, it'll represent the environment in that sense. All right, so here we go. We're now going to build a reward table, which is a kind of table. So we'll inherit from table. And all we need to change here is basically what we store at that location. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off the game world. So you'll see what the game world looks like. You can see it over here. I'm going to start it off with just basically the edges of the game world with walls. I could add functionality that stops the robot from moving out of the game world, the agent from moving out of the game world. But why? Because then I have to have a special case for that. Why not just put a literal wall around the agent and have it learn not to drive out of the warehouse through the wall? So that's what I'll do. So I'll start off the game environment with just the wall on the outside and then empty space on the inside. So all we need to change is the initialization behavior from the normal tables one. And simply, we're not going to change it. We're going to add to it. We're going to still set everything up as before, but we're going to just now initialize it with rules that make sense for the reward table. Namely, don't touch the outside. It's a wall. All right, so def init, it's a member function, so it needs self. And it's going to take all the parameters that the parent one needs, because we're going to actually pass the work up to the parent for it to do the work for us, and then carry on with just the stuff that's specific to a reward table. That's called constructor delegation in most programming languages. To be honest, I'm not sure if Python has its own name for the term, but that's what it is. So we're going to have the dimensions, which will be the tuple, int. We're going to have the upper range. Also a tuple, int. And I'll even leave the defaulting here to be the same, 64. Doesn't really matter. Okay, that's a nice to have. So now we don't want to repeat this work that's already been done in the general table class. We want it to do that work for us already. So we need to send that up to our parent in order to do the work for us. So in Python, the term is a superclass to represent, in this case, table. And we're going to just call its init behavior and send off, well, in this case, I don't even know why I bother. I can send off both tuple dimensions and tuple upper range, and it can do the work for us. All right. Then we just need to actually fill in the table with what I said, with physical with real values in the range minus 50 to 100, and then just have the wall be empty at the beginning. The walls be filled and everything else be empty for now. So we need to do a for loop for every row that's in rows, for every column that's in columns. And then, so what are we going to do here? We're just going to say, yeah, we want to isolate the final row and the top row and the left column and the right column. So that will be when the rows and columns are either 0 or rows -1 or columns -1. Test to see how it looks once we get to the point where we can visualize this. See if we got that right. So row, if the row is 0 or the column is 0, or the row is equal to, no, rows -1, or the column is equal to columns -1. And because this is a derived class for what it's worth of the parent class, I'm just going to grab the values directly. The sort of implicit contract is that if you are a child of this, you should be able to safely access the parent class's stuff because it's written by you, the same person. But if you want to go through the accesses, you can do it. But I didn't write any mutators, so I have to add them if I wanted to. Too much effort. And the contract is basically that you're the same creator of these tables, so you should know what you're doing in terms of accessing quote unquote private data directly. So the convention I use for private data is single underscore, stuff that shouldn't be accessed except via a member function, except from outside the class hierarchy. All right, so yeah, now we need to go for this particular row. And we're just going to, remember, it's a list at the end of the day. So we're just going to add numbers that represent the values we're looking for to the end of the list. That's appending. So dot append. and minus 50 for a wall. Was it? Yeah. Yeah, minus 50, minus 1, and 100 were our values. So minus 50 for wall units. Otherwise, it's just empty space. So that's just going to be minus 1. So once this reward table is built, there will be a proper two-dimensional grid of values representing the rows and columns. And that's all we actually need for a reward table. We'll modify the values in the reward table by way of the user interface. And, so we don't need to really worry too much about that because we've already got the ability to modify values via set item already. So we don't need to do any more work for the reward table. Then the only other kind of table we need is the Q table itself, which is also going to have its own init function for initializing itself. But then the other thing a Q table needs is we need the ability to get the best Q value at a particular location. So so that we can pick the best option. So I'm going to return the best Q value overall, as well as I'm going to return the best action. So remember, the Q table is going to store actions and actual expected quality of actions. So I need to return two things. I need to return the action and the expected quality of that action. So, well, let's first do the easy part. Let's make a Q table, which is a kind of table. We're going to provide our own initializer. That was crazy, man. I have to say, IDEs have gotten crazy good these days. So yeah, that's all I need. Thank you, Crazy AI, or pattern completion for doing that for me. That was helpful. Anyway, okay, so now what do I want? But it has gotten ahead of itself. It doesn't understand that this is slightly different because for a Q table, we don't just want the dimensions and we're not just going to store numbers there. We need to know what the list of legal actions are. So we're going to add a list of actions, which I'm going to make a list of type action, which is just a synonym, a type synonym for string, but it reads in a more general way. All right, so this is fine. I can live with this. So you don't need to do it as a named parameter. It's fine. In fact, we could, yeah, that's fine. Well, leave it, it should be okay. It's not how I would have written it, but still seems fine. That's an ugly named thing. It's okay. That should be fine. All right, here we go. What do we need now? We now need to store our set of actions because that's not handled by the previous parameters. So let's store our set of actions. That's going to be list actions. And then what we basically need to do is to build the table itself. So it's going to be a table of, and each cell can't be a single value. That's not what we want. We need to actually get, when we're at a particular cell in the table, a particular position. For the raw table, we just want a value back. But what we want here is we want to know, basically, we want a dictionary in a sense. We want to say, if I take this action, what is the expected quality of that action in that particular state? So basically, for each of these, we need more information. We don't want to index it on the basis of a number. We want to index it on the basis of an action. So in order to do that, I'm going to use the dictionary data type, which basically it's an associative array. I can index, but not on a number. I'm going to index on the basis of an action, which in this case is just a string. So similar story as before, for every row in the rows, for every column, make a dictionary, so called dict_q, empty dictionary, And then for every action that is possible, I'm going to fill them in that place in the dictionary, but I'm going to give them a starting goodness value, a starting Q value of 0. So for every action that's in my list of, for every action in my list of actions, I'm going to add into the dictionary for that action an initial Q value, which I'm going to have as 0. Now the dictionary exists, so, and it's been populated for that particular place. And I'm going to say self dot space at position R, and I'm going to add that dictionary over there as our Q table. So now we've got the Q table. The only other thing that a Q table does that normal tables don't do that we need to add, as I said, is we need the ability to get the best Q value. Okay, it's going to be at a particular location. Should be a tuple. And then what's it going to give me back? Is it's going to give me two things. It's going to give me a tuple, well, one thing, which is a tuple. It's going to see what action was best and how best was that action. All right, so that's that. Then, so let's actually get the quality values at that particular location. Reuse my existing indexing on coordinates on a two-tuple. Let me find out which one is the best. So Q best, that's going to be a list of sorted on the basis of Q's values. We want the first one. And same story for the best action. Also from Q's, but in this case, it's the keys that we're interested in. Also the first one. And then, well, we actually haven't found the best yet, but we will. It's going to be, we're just basically searching for the best. And the first one is the best one because we haven't seen any of the rest yet. I could sort this in a more Pythonic way, I suppose, but such is life. I'm going to search over all of the items. I'm going to check, are you better? Is your quality better than the best one I've ever seen, which as I said starts off as being the first one. If it is, then the best one I see now is equal to Q, and the best action is the associated action. So A best is equal to A. And now at the end of this, I will have found the best one. And let's return that as a tuple, like I said we would with the best action. Did I say action first? Or did I say, yeah, action first and quality second. So now that will get the best Q value at a particular location along with the action that is associated with that Q value. If two are equal, it will return one of them. It doesn't then really matter. All right, so now we've got the various tables. Now we need the environment within which the agent is going to be embedded. So this will also handle our visualization of the environment and the user interface and things like that. So call this environments, scroll down a bit. And that doesn't inherit from anything, it's just a regular class. It's going to have a constructor, which is going to be made up of taking the number of rows, as well as the number of columns, also an integer, as well as the number of training episodes that we're going to do. also an integer. Nothing more on that. And then obviously you can't have less than one training episode. That doesn't make any sense. So min range exception with an error message. And I'm going to say it's a formatted string. Training must occur at least once. And how many episodes did you actually put in? You put in int episodes. Right, then we just need to start assembling the environment. So we've got going to store our episode count now that we know that it's legal. We're going to store our reward table. Rewards. Choose our reward table, which is going to be made up. Let's just do simple, the two tuple int rows and columns. We're going to actually need to store an agent, but we can't do that yet because we haven't defined the agent. So I will put that in for later. At some point, we need to actually embed our agent into the environment. So for now, we'll come back to that. We need to embed our, we need to start up the visualization engine. So I imported that as just engine, but it's actually Pygame, but it's got a function that will start up the engine connected to the input-output systems and the display and all sorts of things. We want to set a window so that we can see what's going on. So reach into display, set the caption to be Q learning agent, for example. We then want to have an icon for it. So I've got my icons all stored in a directory, all my graphical assets stored in a directory for an asset subdirectory. So you'll see that they're accessed via that. So we need to set your icon, which we need to load as an image in a format compatible with the engine. So engine.image.load, and we're loading that asset. Let's do this in an operating system neutral way. Okay, and now we're going to store the actual images that we use to represent the game environment. So basically the way in which that's done is a bunch of separate images. And as you'll see, nope, wrong. As you'll see, they are the same size, all of them, 64 by 64. They are, actually, I suppose the icon for the game itself is larger, but they're the same size. So the fact that they're the same size is how we're going to draw everything. We're going to lean on the fact that they're all tiles of exactly the same size. And as you can see, the ones that represent things on the top layer have magenta for the background, and that gets replaced through a process known as chroma keying with whatever is in the background. So let's carry on with that. So just so you know what we're actually loading, we need something to store these things in. Typically in game development, we call these sprites. So I'm going to call my collection of these images sprites. And since they are already separated, I'm just going to store them in a dictionary. And then I'm just going to load each of them into a entry in the dictionary with an easy to remember name. So let's say for the basic tile, we'll just call that tile. And we will load from the game engine And we'll do this a lot for all the different images we want. So hopefully I don't make a copy paste error, which is always a danger. So wall, and that wasn't actually called wall, that was called metal. Is it? Yes, metal. It's not a PNG either, it's a bitmap. Bitmap. Fine, mercy itself. All right, let's carry on. So walls, we need to actually display the path at all. I don't remember if I did, but let's load it just in case. Path. And goal. Okay, so the goal is what the agent is going to be looking for. The agent is going to be looking for its power charging place. Now this is one that's on the top layer, so it needs to be chroma keyed. So the way in which chroma keying works is that you set the color that you're going to ignore and replace with whatever the background is, in which case we've picked magenta. So magenta is it's a sort of pink color that you can see. So it's basically just pure red and pure blue mixed together, no green in it. So we can do the same story here. Self._sprites at goal. And now we're not going to load something, it's already there, but we're going to set its color key, color spelled the American way. This is American library. And we just need to send in a 3-tuple to represent the red, green, and blue color component intensities, which are on a scale from 0 to 255, giving a total number of combinations of several millions of colors. But maximum intensity red would be 255, minimum intensity green would be 0, maximum intensity blue would be 255. We'll have to do that for all the ones that are at the top layer, which is basically the agent and the goal. So now we can do the agent itself. Self.agent. No, that's not a thing. Self.sprites. Indexed agent. And same story, set the color key. Oh, set color key. Sorry, not just set color key. Oh, we haven't loaded the agent yet, so let's do that. Okay, and agent. And agent, and it's a bitmap. Yep, there we go. Okay, hopefully all is well. Yelling at me. Okay, so that's loaded all the sprites. And then the last thing we need to do is to actually initialize the game engine itself and grab hold of the window and draw a window for us to draw on. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to have a window. Open close, just plain old window. And that's going to be engine.display. Set it up for a given size. I'm just going to make this fixed size 64 by 64 because that's, or rather a multiple of 64 by 64. It has to be that exact multiple because we're going to use the fact that each tile is the same size. So basically, we'll grab from the reward table the size in terms of rows, multiply by 64. Note that this is this environment isn't a kind of table, so we shouldn't be grabbing underscore rows directly. We're using the accessor property to grab it. And then same for columns. Also multiply by 64. And that is, that's the environment initialized. So we can just have some utility things. Property for the episodes. Just returning those episodes.
Prof. Coulter?
Sure.
There's a comment that you should probably just look at in the chat.
Sure thing. Let's take a look. Typo. Oops. Thank you. Super useful. 119. Oloki. Thank you. Super. Well spotted. And then let's carry on. Okay, so we want to know, basically, has the game ended? So the game ends when the agent has found its reward, or if it's walked into a wall. So basically, that's going to be everywhere where the reward function doesn't return -1. So if you walk into a wall, game over, dead. If you walk into, if you find your prize, success, well done, game over. So we just want to test, is the game over, with a little query function for that. We'll call is terminal, and we'll take in a coordinate for where we are. And it's going to tell us a true or a false value, which is simply a Boolean. And then that's super easy. We just query the underlying rewards table. So return self underscore rewards at that coordinate, and check to see that it's not equal to -1. If it is equal to -1, then we're not terminal. Anything else, that's a terminal state. We're going to be doing clicky with the mouse to basically, we're going to initialize the game environment so that it's empty with just the walls and the walls and the tiles in. But we want to draw our game environment in. So we're going to do that by clicking. So I'm just going to convert between the two coordinate spaces that are in effect. I tend to do things rows and columns, and the game engine does things columns and rows. So we've got a slightly different coordinate space. So I'm just going to have a little function that maps between the two. So it's just going to convert a position from the mouse click and convert that into what I expect. Actually, I don't even know if I'll need to. Yes, I think it is the wrong way around. And also, very importantly, the mouse click will be giving us stuff in multiples of not in multiples of 64, but the game environment is 64 times larger, including rows and columns, than the actual number of cells in the environment. So we need to divide by 64 to convert to a coordinate in our table, not just a pixel on the window we clicked on. So that's important. So we've got a position, which is going to be for the click. That's a member function, so it needs self. And that too will be a tuple. I could have called it TPL click, I suppose. Tuple, that's int and int. And it's going to give us back, actually, this is the way to do it, much better. So do I have an easy way to do this? Is to, no, let's do it with a tuple. Let's do it with a tuple. Let's do it with a tuple. Good luck to us all. Because one way of doing these things is you assign a number to each element in your grid, and it's like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then you can index into that element very easily, or you could just keep things as coordinate pairs. I'm going to keep it as a coordinate pair. Okay, so what we need here is we need to map between them. So we're going to be returning a tuple, and it's going to be the second element of the mouse click divided with integer division by 64. Is that the right way it's facing? Yeah. And then it's going to then be in our second position will be the first element, also divided by 64. So that we can get a coordinate in our grid rather than a pixel number. Right, then the actual running of the environment, it's a game, so we're going to need to capture events, so mouse click events, or when people quit, or if they type in buttons, things to basically control the running of the environment. So I'm going to create a run function, self. I'm going to have a data member that's going to tell me if my game is still running, so continue, which I'm going to start off with true. And then as long as the game should stay running, so while self.continue, keep going. Okay, the instruction in the game environment to draws very low level. This is effectively this engine Pi game is just a thin layer on top of a C library called SDL, the simple direct media layer. So we're going to need something a bit more sophisticated for drawing. So I'm going to make a draw function which will do the heavy lifting, but we want to draw every time the game loops, we want to draw. So for now, that's something that still needs to be done. And then we need to check to see what's happening in the game. So we need to look for events. Events are signals that something has occurred. So we're going to say for event in engine.event.get. So that will get me the current event. And then we check what kind of event is it. And then if there's more details we need, we can look inside the event value to see what more details. So for example, to get its type, we will say if event dot type, and let's handle quitting. So if we're quitting the game, it's stored inside engine. And so engine dot quit. Then we will shut the engine down. So engine dot quit. If it is, and we'll set the continue to be false, stop everything. Prof? Yes.
There's another comment just to help.
Okay, thank you. Did I say asset rather than assets? What let me just read that again. No. Wrong. How do I get that back? There we go. 9116, goal.bmp. That's weird. Oh, I called it power.bmp. Thanks for spotting that. Whoops. Yep, my mistake. Thanks, well spotted. You guys have really good attention to detail. That is excellent. Whew. Let's skip. So we were, okay, thank you. We were fixing our, handling our events. So that's if a quit event occurs. What if a mouse event occurs? Now, with mice, there's different kinds of events. There's button down, button up, simple click events. I'm going to have the thing happen when the mouse button is released. So on button up. So if the thing is a it doesn't see, it's because this is a pre-compiled thing. It doesn't know the types inside it, I think. I'm a bit worried about the lack of code completion. Normally that's a bad sign, but we'll see if we start hitting errors when we run it. In any case, so what are we doing? So the person's released the mouse button. What do we want? We want to get where the mouse was at that point, and we want it in a meaningful sense for us. That's what we created our click to index mapper to do that. And then we could just ask the mouse where it was. Nope. Engine.mouse.position. So this will tell us where the mouse was when it was released. And then basically, so what I'm going to do is we're going to be modifying the reward table, because the reward table will inform what we're drawing. So wherever there's a -1, we'll draw a tile. Wherever there's a -50, we will draw a wall. Wherever there's 100, we will draw the wherever there's 100, we'll draw the power. So for now, I'm going to keep track of the current reward. I'm just going to say 0 for now, and then I'm going to modify that on the basis of what kind of button was clicked. So we'll have, clicking one button will be putting down a wall. Clicking another button will be putting down a tile, and moving, clearing everything and things like that. So here we're going to have a, I'm going to look at the mouse event. We're going to say that its button type is 1. If that's the case, we're going to set R to be equal to -50. Otherwise, if it's 2, they just have different numerical values for which of the buttons is pressed. Then we're sitting down a tile, and then we just want to check if we're moving the agent. So we're going to move the agent in a moment, so we'll have to comment that out for now. But basically, if we're already clicking on an empty tile, so if inside the rewards at position I, we've got already got a -1, then we're going to move the agent there. So we're going to set the agent's location, which we're going to have to sort all that out later. But and move the agent to that position. And then lastly, if the if it was button 3, then we're going to clear everything. So we're going to actually need a function to clear everything. So, or remove the goal at least. So because we only want one goal at a time. Can't be multiple goals in this particular version of the problem. For now, I'll leave it there and we'll set that position to be 100, the reward that we're going to set eventually to be 100. This is not happy though. Oh, it's not happy because that is, so for now, we'll just pass. Okay, all right. So sorry, this is going to be a little bit of other bundles. Maybe just to save typey, I'm just going to grab it. It already exists in an earlier version, and I'll walk you through it if I do have it somewhere. Because it's just going to be more of the same, so we can move on to more interesting things. Somewhere around here should be the similar code. How different is this? Yeah, let's just grab that. That's a lot of very similar code. Now you're unhappy because at the end of the day, we still need to set the reward to be equal to whatever it was that we were building up. So rewards at position I is equal to R. Why is this still moaning though? Because it came with a different level of indentation. Bloody indents. Oh, that's what broke it. Never mind. No, you're indented wrong. Okay, what? Okay, so yeah, this is basically just, we'll have different buttons for moving the character around so we can follow it manually, as well as, I'll actually leave these uncommented because we'll add them now. Okay, so yeah, so this will be that. All right, so for clearing the goal, that's very easy. All we're going to do is we're going to loop over every row and column, and we're going to, if we find 100, we're going to set it to be equal to -1 instead. So to be honest, I don't know if we need to type through all of that. So we are running low on time, so we can take those. I'll just walk you through the code for these two. They're pretty straightforward. So basically, for clearing the goal, all we need to do is we need to loop over every row and over every column, check to see if we've found the goal, which is where the reward table is at 100. And if it is 100, set it to -1. And for getting a list of the open locations so that we know where it's possible for the agent to move to, we're going to just start off with an empty list, loop over every row and over every column. And it's actually not so much for moving as it is for initially starting the agent, because we're going to start the agent at random places in the game environment and see where movement takes us from there, just like we threw random points at the circle in the Monte Carlo simulation. So basically, we're just going to check all the places that have a -1 in the reward table and add them to the list and return that list. So that's all there is for that. And then lastly, I'll walk you through it, but it's not, this is just the boilerplate for the game environment. This is the actual draw function, which does that work. I'll step you through it one step at a time, but it's not super complex. The bit that makes it look scary is the low-level drawing operation. It's called blitting, binary linear interpolation, but it basically just means draw. So what we're saying is we're going to draw this particular tile at this particular location. So all we're doing is we're looping over every number of row and column, and we're drawing the tile at that position, offset by 64, drawing that tile at that location. We just draw, 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 draw. And then what we're going to do then is all changes to the display don't take effect until you reverse the modification buffer with the display buffer. So that's what flip does. It basically just means show. So all we're doing here, looping over every row and every column, checking to see what the value is at the reward table at those locations, drawing the appropriate tile at the appropriate location. The only other thing that is slightly different is I was going to, I don't know if I'll work through, it's not that important, highlight the path of the agent. What we'll do instead is we'll walk through the agent manually, and you'll see the decisions that it makes. So what we're going to do now is we're going to build the actual agent itself. So that's just going to be literally converting that Bellman equation and temporal difference equation into code. So what we're going to do there is we're going to have an initialization function, which is going to take in the epsilon value and the lowercase gamma value and the alpha value for those Bellman equations, for the reinforcement learning equations. Remember, epsilon is the one used in epsilon greedy. It says how often we explore rather than pick the best option. Gamma was the discount function, which said how heavily do we weight near-term rewards to future rewards. And then alpha was the learning rate. It's how basically quickly we commit things to the event table. And we're also going to include the environment for the agent. So there's nothing really interesting happening there, so I'm just going to move it. One thing that's ugly, it doesn't support the bloody character that I was using. I tend to write my code with, if possible, if there's a math formula, I will use the actual symbol, because you can write your code with Greek symbols. So if I find my test version here, yeah, so, but mostly often people just do things like use E and Y and A instead of the Greek symbols, but I always thought it makes it match the formulas more, so why not? So effectively what we're doing here, testing that they're in range, these weights need to be between 0 and 1, so we just enforce that and then store them locally. We have a copy of the environment that we keep track of so that we can take our actions, and we just store it. So that's all very straightforward. What we do next is we need to pick a random location to start in, because you don't always start in the same place. That's equivalent to throwing the darts in the Monte Carlo Pi simulation. So we pick a random place from the list of open locations that we generated previously over here. And then we've got our set of actions. As I said, that's used as an alias for strings. We've got up, down, left, and right as the directions we can move in. And we create our queue table using the rows and the columns and the set of actions. Actually, in this case, I did make the size different. Hope that's not going to be a problem. And the path which I was going to highlight, I started off as an empty path. But I don't know how important that is. So we're going to work through the stuff manually. So what I'm going to do now, or what we're going to look through now is, again, very simple code that's just going to deal with saying where I am, changing where I am, changing my path, and reading a value from the Q table, which are going to basically be my sensing and acting things. So I'm going to just put those in. We're not going to look at them in too much detail because they're quite simple, but we're going to then stop just before choose, because choose and inference are where the actual work is going to happen, and training is where the actual work is going to happen. So this should be okay. So basically all it is, retrieve my current location, test my new location for safety before moving there, return the path, set the path, and read the current value in the Q table based on where I am. So really nothing interesting there. The interesting work will come with choosing our action. So choosing is basically implementing epsilon greedy. So choosing means we have to sometimes take a good action and sometimes take a poor action. So it's going to be a mapping between our current states and an action. So what do we need? We need to know what the current quality values are. So we're going to sense at our current location what the Q values are at that point for the different actions. We're then going to sometimes pick the best action and sometimes pick the worst, pick a random action. So we'll do that by generating a random number and comparing it to our epsilon value. So we're going to use the random number generator to generate a random number between 0 and 1 and check to see whether it's less than our epsilon value. If it is less than our epsilon value, we're going to take the best action. So a best and don't care, and grab that value from the Q table and tell it, oopsie, Q table, get the best Q value based on my current location. Otherwise, some small portion of the time, we're going to just pick a random thing. Oh, sorry, I need to return that action. Some random portion of the time, we're going to pick a random, some smaller portion of the time, we're going to pick a random option. This is so we can explore the environment. So again, we're going to do random, and we're going to pick a random value from a list. And it's going to be the list of all the possible keys from that dictionary. So pick a random choice. That'll be an action. Right, so that's effectively the alpha epsilon greedy choice. Then, okay, we've got inference where we just follow the path. We're just going to actually do that manually. But we've also got the important things of actually taking an action and of training. Taking an action isn't too complicated. So that one I'm going to just move the code through. I'll talk you through it, but it's really not part of the problem itself. So all we do when we take an action is we get the action as input, and then we basically work out where we want to go, our target row and target column, and adjust it. We assume we're going to stay still, and then based on whether we're moving up, down, left, or right, we'll adjust either the row or column value respectively to move us one value in those directions, update our location, and report the fact. Then obviously bad things could happen depending on where we moved, or good things could happen, but the actual act of moving is fairly straightforward. Now, the last bit, this is the actual core of the algorithm, so we're a little bit over time, but not too much, because this really is the final bit, is the actual implementation of the updating of the learning function, which basically just relates to converting the Bellman equation into Python code. So this is where we're updating ourselves. So just for seeing what's going on, we're going to put the fact that we're training. Where did we start? We're going to store that in a starting location. We're then going to loop over as many training episodes as we stored in the environment. So for en the number of training environments, which should be stored in self.env.episodes. Did I make a property for that? I think I did. So for every episode, and just output which episode we're in. And then say where we're going to move somewhere randomly. So we're not so much we're going to move somewhere randomly, we're going to start somewhere randomly. So this is the act of throwing the dart at the dartboard. So if we started somewhere randomly, let's pick that from our list of options, which again comes from the open locations in the environment. And then as long as we haven't reached a terminal state, so while not self.environment.is terminal, our current location. Okay, so we haven't walked into a wall or found the goal. And we're going to say, where are we at the beginning of our move? So this is at the beginning of the entire training sequence. This is in our current decision, where are we starting from? So self.location. And we're then just going to print some output to keep track of what's going on. So we're in self.location, which has the current Q values, which we can output self.Q table, and where we are now. Okay, so this will tell us what we see at the current place in the environment. Then we need to pick an action. So we've got a function for that now. So A is equal to self.choose. And then, so we'll say what action we picked. Okay, and then we're going to get the quality of that action that we've picked based on our current location. So that's the starting quality. Grab that from the Q table at this location. Oopsie. At this location, and for this particular action. So how good is doing the action we just chose. Let's just keep that visible. So formatted string, so quality of action is going to be, nope, wrong, Q start. Then we're going to do the thing. So that's now self.act. Oops. And then how well did this pay off? So what was the reward for doing this? We'll have to query the reward table for that. So in the environment, in the reward table, at this location, this is in our new location, by the way, because we've moved, the act will have triggered a change in our location. So how well did this immediate reward pay off? So immediate reward for action is going to be reward. And then we've now in a new location, so print now in new location, and what's the quality of this new location, I suppose would be useful to know. We do just have it. I think we can live with that. QStart wouldn't have changed, so that's fine. And then we want to know what the best qualities qualities were, because we now need to update the Q table. So we're not so interested in the action, but we're interested in the best quality of the location we're in now. So self.QTable, get the best quality for our new location. That should be okay. So now we need to work out the temporal difference. So how did our lot in life improve based on where we were to where we got to? So that's going to be our reward plus the discount factor, not y, gamma. Gamma, so the discount factor multiplied by that best quality at our location. And the difference is what we're trying to work out, is how much was that different, better or worse, than where we started. So what we earned, how good things look now versus where we were when we started. So we can print that out. And then what we want is we want to work out our new Q value based on the temporal difference and the learning rate to update the Q table at our new location, saying, rather at our old location, saying, if we took the decision that we took previously, this is how your lot in life changes, having taken that decision. So we got the new Q value, which is going to be based on our old Q value at the beginning, added to the difference in our Q values, offset by our learning rates to change. Why does that not? Our learning rates, alpha, so how quickly we learn from our experience. Now we actually update the Q value, the Q table itself, so self.QTable. In our starting location, based on taking that previous action, is the new Q value. So what did we learn from our experience? How did the world change? So we can just print that out. Updating Q value from our current location for the action we picked to our new Q value. End of line. All right, so once that's done, so that's basically just one hop. So what we need to do is we need to move back. Oh, sorry, that's the whole training process covered for all of the environments. But when we're done, we're going to move back to our starting location. That feels wrong. Why is my... Oh, because I put this outside of the function. And then some more. And then training is complete. So we've done our learning. And just so you can see what the final Q value looks like, we could loop over every open location. What was the Q value at that location? Print, formatted string. And so we're at a particular place. What is our location? Or at that location, at that open location, what is the Q value? I feel like I'm formatting this wrong, which I am. What is our Q value in that location? Yeah, and that'll give us the output for that. And then literally all we've got left is to actually run the program. So if this is main, build an environment. So we need to add the agent to the environment. So some size, some number of training epochs, and run the environment. And setting the agent up, question mark, because we didn't have the agent yet. Yeah, so we just need to build an agent with some reasonable values. So for the epsilon, 90% of the time we want to take the best action. So we'll make that 0.9. We're going to favor new information fairly heavily over old information. And we're going to commit, we're going to learn fairly quickly. What's the right values? There's no answer to that that's correct, because you basically have to keep track of it depends on the problem domain. So finding the right hyperparameters for any particular algorithm is part of the problem. So you'd have to experiment. And then we need to pass the environment, which is what we're currently in, to the agent so that it has access to it. So we pass self to it. So that should be that. Since we're a little bit over time, I'm not going to go through the whole rigmarole of debugging it. I'll run the version that I baked at home earlier. But you should see it start up, and it should be fairly, oopsie, agent. So first it'll start up the game environments and render the environment that we started, place the agent at a random location, and put walls everywhere. So we want to move things around, and I think we want to make it look like the example we got here. Let's move our agent. I can't remember which button I said for that. Nope, wrong. Nope. What did I use to move my agent? What button was that? Oh, did I even put that in? I think I did. Button. Yeah, oopsie. Try that again. Oh, okay, you happen to spawn in the right spot, so never mind. Let's build our environments. And sort of doesn't have to be exact, but what? I said I haven't done a good parameter study for this. I'm not actually sure what the right values for the Q values and things should be. So this is, it's not going to be quite the same, but hopefully it'll be okay. And wop. Yeah, close enough. Hopefully. Okay, it's not quite the same, but it should still be okay. And then we want
you're not sharing your screen anymore.
Oh, how did that happen?
No idea.
Oh, I must have bumped it. I think I slipped. Share screen, it says. Let me unshare and reshare. How long ago did that stop? Just recently.
Oh, we can see it now. Perfect.
No. Okay, weird. Okay, anyway, that's fine. Okay, so this is not quite the same environment as in the picture, but it should be close enough, hopefully. I think I made that too. Oh, all right, of course, that's right. You draw on an empty spot. That's what I said. Okay, so let's say its charging point is, nope. There. All right, so now let's train it. What on earth did I set was the training button? The training button was going to be space, apparently. So let's train. So you'll see in the background, it's going to do a lot of sampling and updating values and so on. all it's doing is it's basically throwing those darts at the dartboard, spawning the agent in random positions, moving until it dies, starting again until as many training epochs as we said are going to be completed. So building up an understanding of what the environment looks like. Now it has an understanding of the environment for all the legal positions. It has a quality value for every action it could take in those positions. So let's work through it one by one, and we can see what the inference process would be like from the agent's point of view. So here we are at that position. And what we see there is we see a bunch of quality values. So we want to take the best one. The best one is the one with the highest value. So they're negative, but the highest value is up. So let's move up. Okay, so over here, we can see again, the highest value is still up. So we move up. And again, the highest value is still up. So we move up. Trust me, the highest value was up, but now we're over here. And what we can see here now, ooh, this is such a border case. Dang, no, this one is. But is it even? Gosh, is this one going to convince me wrong? Did I not train well? I actually think this is such left. Is that even higher? 0.9. One didn't work out that well. This one's actually, this one hasn't quite learned it properly because this one wants to go up now. So that's not fully correct. Let's try again. Sorry, as I said, I haven't set those Q values, sorry, those alpha and gamma values are just made up. So, and the number of epochs are just, oh no, I have to do the whole thing again. Oh, I really should have set it to respawn. Okay, anyway. All right, let's do this again. And then whatever it takes, it takes. We'll yeah. Let's just hope for the best. Whatever. Now whatever. All right, let's try that one. Let's see. That's it. Didn't really sensibly set those parameters, but it was close. But I do think that that would have been a case where it would have been making a wrong decision. Hopefully this one comes out better. Okay, it definitely wants to move up. Okay, and now please tell me you want to move left. Yes, you very much want to move left now, so now it's not confused anymore. Now, okay, it's left was always the best choice. Now we can see down is by far the best choice. And still down is the best choice. And now it should be right is the best choice, which it is. And down is the best choice. Yep, quite dramatically so. As we get closer to the goal, you'll see the absolute values will get higher. The absolute values don't really mean much. It's just the relative values when you're making a decision that are meaningful. But you'll see they will get closer to 100 the closer we get. So down it still thinks is the best choice. And left should be the best choice, which it is. Left. Presumably left was the best still. Left. Yep. And then left again, and presumably left again. Yep. And now it should be favoring up, which it grammatically is. So up. It will just be ups, I promise you. Up. And now you can see that it knows for an absolute certainty that moving up will get its complete reward. So that takes it to the final state. So that's the basic idea. So we ran a little bit over time of reinforcement learning and Q-learning in particular. Obviously, you can generalize it because any sort of environment that you can represent is a set of states and a set of actions, whatever those actions could be. It doesn't have to be a 2D environment. It can be as many dimensions as you want. It doesn't have to be a physical space. It can just be a set of choices that you make based on some measurable state, and you can update as long as you can come up with a payoff matrix for a given action, a set of actions. You can then say, based on those actions, I will take these decisions, and I will update my understanding of the cumulative reward over time based on how well this action paid off to me now versus how much it did, how good my previous state was. And then you obviously have to find the right values for how much do I favor new information over old information, as well as how quickly do I learn new information over old information. And as you can see, you can get situations like we had in that run where due maybe to the random sampling or whatever, but it got to that point and it kind of didn't know whether moving up or moving to the left was best. Maybe it undersampled these areas in its random generation. Maybe the learning rate wasn't set to what it should be, or the epsilon really wasn't set to what it should be. Again, finding those correct parameter values requires you to do a parameter study to see what to set them to so that your thing can behave correctly in your particular problem domain. But that's basically that. So that's reinforcement learning. That's learning without data, but with an environment that you can try to do things in and see how well they go. So I think that's it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, unless there's any particular questions that require me to move to a particular screen.
Yeah, and on that note, are there any questions for Prof? Doesn't seem like it, but you can always contact him if there are any pressing questions, or contact me if you'd like further information. I just want to thank you very much. That was an amazing presentation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you, everyone.
And now just to remind you all that tomorrow we're going to have another presentation again. And this is going to be on the problem of missing data. So I look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Nope. Okay, goodbye. Not used to Zoom, so hopefully I'll just quit that. Goodbye.